My name is Radhika Desai, and I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group, which is the chief organizer of this event. The International Manifesto Group started as a discussion group among a very international group of essentially scholars and activists from all around the world. And we basically began to essentially start a discussion group whose purpose was, number one, to try to understand what's going on in the context of the pandemic, and number two, to try to understand what it is that progressive people, particularly those who are concerned both about capitalism and imperialism, who are socialists as well as imperialists, what they should try to do. Over the course of the past year and, year and a bit, quite a bit, 19-20 months or so, we've organized a lot of events like this, and all of which have deepened our understanding of what's going on. And over the last summer, we have written a manifesto, because one of the chief purposes of the group was precisely to figure out what is to be done. So we have a manifesto, and I'm going to put the link to the manifesto in the chat. Please take a look at it. We have already have it in many languages. Arabic and Farsi translations are coming. And I hope very much you will take a few minutes to take a look at it, consider whether you'd like to sign it, join us in helping us propagate it and hold events like this and so on. So with that, I'm going to hand over to the moderator of today's panel. Her name is Claudia Chauffin. Claudia, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika, and welcome everyone. Welcome friends and colleagues and comrades all over the world. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited to announce this panel that has been in the coming for a long time in my mind, and with people I very much admire, whose work I very much admire. So let me just tell you what the panel is about, and just repeating what we wrote in the invitation. In the late 1970s, Edward Said wrote the defining characteristic distinguishing the Palestinian experience from that of the rest of the Arab world was, and I'm quoting from The Question of Palestine, its traumatic national encounter with Zionism, close quote. Launched by the arrival, this experience, launched by the arrival of the first wave of Zionists to Palestine in 1880s. Now, close to 100 years later, today, this experience is alive and well. I've had my own personal opportunities to become acquainted with it very closely. The settler colonial ethnocratic state of Israel controls all of historic Palestine. This control is sustained politically, economically, and militarily by all leaders of the capitalist West, their allies, and a quote unquote peace process designed to indefinitely normalize and prolong what the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem has dubbed, again between quotes, an apartheid regime. The question for us today is, can historic Palestine ever harbor a true democratic state? What would that state look like? Can those who desire a better world support this goal? And what would this support look like? So the panel, our guests today, our speakers, will explore these and related questions, drawing from their own perspective of decades-long joint collective experience in the struggle for a democratic state in Palestine. So that's what we're going to address today. We're going to start with Munir Nuseibah. I hope I pronounced your last name, Munir, correctly. I'm just reading it in Spanish. Nuseibah is a human rights lawyer and academic based in Al-Quds University in Jerusalem, Palestine. He's an assistant professor at Al-Quds University's Faculty of Law, the director and co-founder of Al-Quds Human Rights Clinic, the first accredited clinical legal education program in the Arab world. And he's also the director of the Community Action Center in Jerusalem. Munir holds a degree in international legal studies from Washington College of Law of the American University in Washington, D.C., and a PhD degree from the University of Westminster in London, UK, where his thesis dealt with forced displacement in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, international law, and transitional justice. Welcome, Munir. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and you did pronounce my name exactly in the right way, so thank you. And many thanks for organizing this important event, and it's really my pleasure and honor to be with you in this event and with all the other distinguished panelists who I'm looking forward also to learn from their experiences. I chose today to talk about why I support a single democratic state in Palestine. And I would say from the beginning that I have mainly two reasons. One is related to my beliefs and career, belief system and career, and the other one is related to family tradition. So I will start with the first one, which is probably the more detailed one that I can describe. I am a human rights defender. You just read, my short biography. I'm a human rights defender. That's what I do on a daily basis. I chose to pursue the human rights field for my education and career because I believe that all human beings are equal and should be able to enjoy their basic rights regardless of their ethnic, religious, or national identity. My understanding of the situation in Palestine is also informed by this background. It's informed by my understanding and my view of the world through the human rights point of view. As many who are present here might know, Palestine was colonized by European power, Britain, which decided to set up a continuous colonial regime even after it ended its presence. It colonized Palestine. It decided to create a Jewish state in Palestine. It started inviting Jewish immigration in a place where the majority of the population was not Jewish, but it also invited this specific immigration because it wanted to create this ethnic state, a Jewish state. By the end of the British Mandate in 1947, the Jewish population of Palestine was still a minority. They were around 30% of the whole population of Palestine. So instead of allowing for all of the Palestinians who existed at the time, whether they were Jewish or Arab or regardless of their ethnic or religious background, Britain sought the partition of Palestine into two states and managed to get a UN General Assembly resolution that also recommended this partition in order to create two different ethnic states. What happened immediately after that recommendation is what we call in the Palestinian understanding and this Palestinian history, the Nakba, the catastrophe. It's a war in which 80% of the Palestinians that lived in the areas that became actually Israel after that war were displaced. All of this population was displaced. They were prevented from return using the Israeli legal system, preventing Palestinians who were displaced from citizenship, enacting specific laws in order to confiscate their property, and in order to make sure that they will not be allowed to return. Those who attempted to return after that were called infiltrators, which is a crime that was invented in the Israeli law specifically in order to prevent Palestinians from return. Then Israel in 1967 occupied the remaining part of Palestine known as the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza Strip, and then displaced also almost one quarter to one third of the population of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, and then created a military regime in the West Bank and Gaza, and started a long process of persecution that continues until the current day. What we see on a continuous basis, and now I'm going back to my own career as a human rights defender. I work in a center, as you mentioned, called Community Action Center. We provide free legal aid to Palestinians on a daily basis, mainly trying to help these Palestinians to be able to continue living in Jerusalem. The laws that we face on a daily basis are laws that continuously displace Palestinians. For example, Israel revokes the residency status of Palestinians from Jerusalem, rendering their stay in Jerusalem illegal according to Israeli law, based on a number of justifications, like that they have traveled abroad for a certain period of time, they have moved their center of life, as the Israeli law calls it, somewhere else, or they breached allegiance to the state of Israel, which is a relatively new invention in the Israeli legal system. Also, Israel prevents Palestinians in Jerusalem to register their children as residents also in Jerusalem, based on the very complicated bureaucratic system that Israel and law that Israel has created and institutionalized on a daily basis. We have to defend Palestinian children in order that these children can live under the same roof with their parents while having a legal status. Many children don't pass that exam and eventually end up living in Jerusalem without a legal status. They end up without any rights living in Jerusalem only because they are Palestinians. When you compare this to any Jewish children who are born here, if a Jewish tourist couple are in Israel, according to Israeli law, if they have a child, this child becomes an Israeli citizen automatically only because his or her parents are Jewish. But we Palestinians who live in Jerusalem, who stayed in Jerusalem for millennia or centuries, or as long as it can be, depending on whatever roots a person comes from, we have to continue working on our right to simply live in the city. Also, Israel has laws that restrict Palestinian families from living together, husbands and wives. It restricts the right of Palestinians from the West Bank or Gaza to live in Jerusalem with their spouses, with their family members. This is something that I am dealing with on a daily basis. And I observe that while all of these issues are encountered by Palestinians on a continuous basis only for the purpose of engineering demography in Jerusalem in order to make it as more Jewish and less Palestinian, I can see that the Jewish population of Jerusalem and of Palestine in general are enjoying perfect rights, even subsidies and encouragement to live and to flourish and to settle in our lands, in our houses. So this is something that I am experiencing every day. But that's not the only thing I'm experiencing. I'm also experiencing different methods that are used by Israel in order to maintain this regime. The way that Israel oppresses Palestinians. For example, we have been dealing with the issue of collective punishment. If Israel accuses a person of terrorism, then they have, according to the Israeli law and authorized by the Israeli Supreme Court, which is mistaken by many people as a court that defends human rights. That's certainly not true by anybody who actually deals and understands the Israeli Supreme Court. It authorized that the Israeli government can demolish the family house of a person who is accused of terrorism, even if that person has been killed or imprisoned. So while they might have punished that person for whatever action that he allegedly did, they can demolish his family house, they can seal the family house, they are revoking residencies from family members. So they are combining the oppression and suppression of persons who of individuals with their goal of displacement. But also, I am on a continuous basis observing how Israel is offending and suppressing human rights defenders. The most recent example is actually the craziest. Now we are getting to peaks that we have not even seen in the past, despite all the things that we have seen in the past. Israel has recently declared 6 organizations, 3 of which are human rights organizations, very reputable, very respected around the world as terrorist organizations. Now, everybody who is a member of these organizations, an employee, a director, etc., has become a terrorist from the power of Israeli law. Suddenly, a person who was documenting human rights violations or going to Europe or to other places around the world to advocate on behalf of victims, suddenly is now described as a terrorist only because of the type of work they do. All of these elements are elements of the persecution regime that is building what, as you mentioned in your introduction, Beit Salem, Human Rights Watch, Yesh Din, Al-Haq, Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies, and many others have called an apartheid regime. This regime is a regime that is working continuously in order to establish supremacy of Jews over non-Jews in Palestine. Supremacy, domination on a continuous basis. They insist that this is a Jewish state. They even insisted from Palestinian negotiators and Palestinian officials that they want a recognition not only of Israel, because the PLO recognized Israel a long time ago. No, but they want a recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. And this shows how this regime has a problem, a very basic problem, and it's a racial problem. This is one of the most important reasons why that invite me to want a one state. A one state is a state that allows to change this regime, even though we can also theoretically imagine changing this regime in a two-state solution as well, right? So that's not necessarily the only way in which we can change that regime. However, it will allow us to change that regime. It will allow all those who are displaced to return to their homes. One of the biggest issues in the current so-called peace process is the refugees. Can they return home? Well, according to international law and to human rights law, they have to come back. However, they are entitled to. However, what politicians say is that, but if they come back, then there will be one Palestinian state in Israel and another Palestinian state in Palestine, because the majority of the population will be might become in Israel because of the return. So therefore, in my opinion here, what best would serve human rights is one democratic state, a state that doesn't look at a person according to her or his religious or national or ethnic identity, but it gives consideration and respect to every human being, mainly because of their being human. And now, very briefly, I'm going to say the second reason and my family tradition reason. I come from the family that is called Nuseibah. Family, as some of you might know in this Zoom room, has been opening and closing the Church of Holy Sepulchre for more than 1,000 years, maybe 1,400 years, some narratives say 1,000 years. We are a Muslim family, right? So we're not Christians, but the reason why the Nuseibah family has been doing this task is because the different Christian sects in the church because all of them, they love the church, and this church is where Christians believe that Jesus Christ was crucified and then ascended to heaven from that specific place. So the Catholics and the Orthodox, they all want to have they all have shared different faith. Mr. Henry, your mic is opened and we can hear your
Maybe people
conversation.
can people mute themselves? I'm sorry, I forgot to warn folks about that because sometimes we don't notice, so that we can hear Munir.
Mr. Henry Louis, we can hear your voices.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank
Go
you.
ahead,
Thank
Munir.
you. Okay. So I was saying and ending basically with talking about my family tradition. And so this church is loved by every Christian in the world because it's where, you know, the miracle happened, right? Where Jesus was crucified and ascended to heaven according to the Christian belief. And that's certainly, you know, the symbol of Christianity is the crucifixion and the burial and the rising. And because the Christian groups had an issue about whose church is it? Is it a Catholic church? Is it an Orthodox church? Is it Armenian? Is it for the Greeks? Is it for the Pope? You know, they decided to share it because they all love it, and they decided to give the key to somebody who has no claim over the church, if you know, the Nuseibah family. And they decided also to rotate the control over the grave area where it is believed the most important spot in the church is just below the dome, is where it is believed that Jesus Christ ascended to heaven, right? So they have a rotation. And the Nuseibah family member is there as part of the status quo. And one of the things that he does is that he declares the times for the rotation. So he knocks the door from the outside. He doesn't go inside, he knocks from the outside, and then the rotation happens and different churches exchange their control over that space. So from that example, everybody can learn that if we all love a certain place so much, we don't have to take it, you know, it doesn't have to be owned by one sect only. It should be shared, certainly. So in the same way, if I am convinced that we, the Palestinians, love Palestine so much, and I understand that also the Jewish population of Palestine and the Jews around the world, they also love Palestine and they also love Jerusalem and they also have that important religious tradition. Therefore, I don't see why, for any reason, would Jewish presence here mean that I have to leave, right? So if we establish one democratic state that gives equal rights to every person in this land, and that allows all the refugees to return, and that establishes transitional justice for every person here, I think certainly that this would certainly be the best solution, that because it's not built on any ethnic lines or religious lines. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Munir. Thank you so much. That ends it on a very sort of hopeful note. It's a nice thing to know, sharing something that you love with other people who love the same thing. Why cannot that be done with the whole of the land? So the next speaker assigned is in the list is Jonathan Kuttab, is Executive Director of Friends of Sabeel, North America, co-founder of the Palestinian human rights group Al-Haq, and co-founder also of Nonviolence International. A well-known international human rights lawyer, Jonathan practices law in the US, Palestine, and Israel, serves on the board of Bethlehem Bible College, and is co-founder and board member of Just Peace Advocates. He was head of the legal committee to negotiate the Cairo Agreement of 1994 between Israel and the PLO, and I may Jonathan also has a very, very compelling book that is free online. Probably it's still there, that you may want to mention, make a pitch for that book at the end. Welcome, Jonathan, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'll try to limit myself in time, since we have such a wonderful and distinguished panel to discuss some very, very serious questions. As you mentioned at the beginning, it is true that the experience of Palestinians has been molded by its confrontation as a national movement with the Zionist movement for the last century or more. And that has been a very traumatic and painful struggle for both sides, but particularly for the Palestinians. So without in any way pretending that there is any symmetry or equality between the two sides, either legally, morally, historically, or otherwise, we realize that there is this confrontation that needs to come to some kind of conclusion. For many years, people thought that the conclusion was separation and dividing the land between the two, which is the so-called two-state solution. Particularly after 1967, this became almost the golden standard that everybody followed. Everybody thought that that's really the solution, and the problem is that to have the political will to bring it about. However, the reality on the ground, and I must admit, I was one of those who really believed in the two-state solution and who thought that maybe it's a pragmatic way to deal with a very painful, difficult situation. But the reality on the ground is that while the Palestinian side accepted this solution and the Arab and Muslim countries accepted that framework as the possible pragmatic solution, the reality on the ground was that the Israeli side systematically undermined that possibility to the point where it was no longer feasible or possible. Over 700,000 Jews are living in that small 22% of Palestine that was slated to be a Palestinian Arab state. So that's no longer possible. In fact, the Zionist side feel that they have total and complete control over everything, and that they have militarily, technologically, financially, economically, at every level, they are the dominant party. Why should they accept any kind of solution? But in addition to the power imbalance, which I have just described, there is also, I think, a misunderstanding of what democracy really means, of what a democratic solution would mean to Israeli Jews, who may genuinely seek, some of them, a resolution, a just and peaceful resolution. And one of the problems is, I think, a misunderstanding of what democracy means. Many people, particularly in the Middle East, have this concept that democracy means voting and means 51% of the population votes in a government and they are free to totally suppress, oppress, eliminate, totally, and also disenfranchise everybody else. That is why demography becomes a very important element, because for them, how can we accept the right of return? It changes demography. How can we allow Palestinians to have equality? Because under equality, they may one day become, in fact, they may be already 51% of the population. So in order to really promote a democratic solution, we must understand that democracy is not just voting, is not just a tyranny of 51%. That democracy, for it to succeed, needs to have a constitutional basis that guarantees and respects the rights of the individual and the rights of substantial minorities. I think it is important that Jews, Christians, Muslims in Palestine need to feel comfortable enough that regardless of who has 51%, their rights are respected. That a democratic process, which has elections as a basic part of it, obviously, does not give license to 51% who get elected to a particular parliament to oppress the rights of others, to deny the rights of others, to eliminate the real existential interests that each party has, regardless of who has the majority. So in trying to envision a democratic society or a democratic resolution in Israel-Palestine, we need to also address this issue, what I call the demographic demon, or the fallacy of 51%, that democracy means 51% can control what everybody does. So I wrote a little book called Beyond the Two-State Solution, where I try to address this particular problem. What do you do when the two-state solution clearly can no longer happen? What can you envision of a society that addresses the genuine existential needs of both sides, Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs? How can these two movements or these two groups who have always thought in zero-sum terms, that if I have one more immigrant coming in or one more baby being born, somehow I gain. And if I have one more dunam confiscated, somehow I gain and the other side loses. How can we envision a situation where it can be win-win, where both sides can live, thrive, and be enriched rather than at the cost of the other side? And this means that we have to change our understanding of Zionism as well as Palestinian nationalism. I can no longer say Palestine Arabiya if there are half the population living in Palestine are not Arab. And they're going nowhere. They're going nowhere. And how can you claim to have a Jewish state, as Jewish as France is French, when half the people living under the authority of that state are not Jews? And they're going nowhere. We must find a resolution that addresses both sides in a positive rather than negative way. As I said, I wrote a little book called Beyond the Two-State Solution, and you can download it for free from the Nonviolence International website. I think we can post the link in the chat at some point, but you can download it and read it as a vision. Now, again, I must emphasize, I am not addressing the merits of each side's arguments. I am not in any way suggesting that there is any symmetry or equality between the two sides. I am just trying to present a vision that suggests itself to people of goodwill on both sides and also to important third parties outside. Because this conflict has continued for a long time precisely because there are substantial, powerful forces outside the regions who support either Zionism or who support Palestinian nationalism, not so much these days, but to keep this process between the two parts from ever reaching a just and a peaceful resolution. Now, I understand that it is probably easier said than done. I understand that this is just a vision, a hope, a dream that we are presenting. But people die when there is no vision, when there is no dream to believe in, when there is no positive thing to work towards. The feeling of despondency and hopelessness that many are feeling today in Israel, in Palestine, and in the international community is there is nothing to do. And in Hebrew they say, Ein ma lasot, there is nothing to do. This feeling of despondency and hopelessness is a very dangerous phenomenon that needs to be fought. I think people of goodwill on both sides need to have a positive vision that we can work towards. The human rights of all sides, human dignity, human worth, not to mention international law, not to mention common decency and humanity, requires that we move away from the paradigm which today exists. The paradigm that exists today is, in fact, total domination by one side, a system of apartheid that is both in fact and in law ruling the entire area, where being Jewish is your ticket to rights, to residency, to jobs, to prosperity, to security, to safety, to participation in political life, and to the ability to dominate and determine outcomes. Whereas if you are not Jewish, then your history, your family ties, your national aspiration, your right of self-determination, your human rights are worth nothing. This is the imbalance that needs to be addressed by both sides, and I think it can be addressed through a genuinely democratic process that gives both sides genuine equality, genuine respect, and genuine human rights. I have much more to say, but I will stop here in order to provide an opportunity for all the other participants to present their views and urge all of us to work towards a just solution. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Jonathan. That was very, very inspiring. Both of you were so inspiring. Well, let's move to Miko Peled. Miko is a writer, a human rights activist, born and raised in Jerusalem. He supports the Palestinian call, for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, and the creation of a single democratic state or democracy on all of historic Palestine. He's published a book, The General Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. The first I encountered, I have to say, was a transformative experience for me. Miko is a Pulitzer Prize winner. Alice Walker says of his account, few books on the Palestine-Israel issue seem as hopeful to me as this one. Now, his second book is titled Injustice, The Story of the Holy Land, Foundation 5. Welcome, Miko. Take it away, please.
Thank you so much. Thanks for holding this incredible panel, and thank you for allowing me to be part of it. It's great to be with all these great people on this panel. It's a great honor. I'll jump right into it. The initial question you posed, can Palestine become a democracy? I would say it absolutely can become a democracy. I don't think there's any question about the fact that it can become a democracy. Indeed, I think it must become a democracy. But it does depend on people like ourselves. It depends on people of conscience around the world. And unless people of conscience around the world, or what is called the constituency of conscience around the world, acts fiercely in a determined and uncompromising way, it's never going to happen. So the theoretical side, yes, of course it can happen. The practical side, it's only going to happen if we act. Now, we were all, many of us were, not all of us, but many of us were drugged by this two-state solution idea. And it worked as a great strategy for the Zionists in order to numb everybody. So pushing for this idea of a two-state solution, well, initially the partition plan, but then later on the partition based on a two-state solution post-1967 war worked very effectively in order to lower the guard of the Palestinian resistance, to lower the guard of activists who believed in people who believed in Palestinian rights, And then when people thought, here we are, the Palestinians have agreed to recognize Israel, to end their resistance and so forth, boom, we realized what many people, what some people realized from the very beginning, that this was nothing but a strategy by the Zionists in order to strengthen their control over Palestine, strengthen their control over the resources and the people and so forth. And so I think it's important in the outset to make it absolutely clear that this whole notion of a two-state solution was part of a disingenuous Zionist strategy, which allowed the Zionists to continue with their project, which is to create a single state that they call a Jewish state over all of Palestine. Now, I think it's important to clarify something here. I don't think that we should refer to the Jewish people who live in Palestine as Jews. I think their identity, or our identity, is Israelis. It's a different creation. It's not Jews and Christians and Muslims. It's Israelis and Palestinians, because the religion is not the issue here. It's the national identity, which is Israelis. Even though on our ID it says Jewish, we are Israelis. It's a new creation. It's a little bit like, I like to compare it like the white people in South Africa. They're not really indigenous. I mean, they've been there for a long time, but they're a result of settler colonialism and so on. And so are we as Israelis. So the two nations that live in Palestine are Israelis and Palestinians. It's not Jews. I wouldn't say Jews, Arabs, and I mean Jews, Muslims, and Christians. That's not how I would define it. And of course, we realize that Israelis, like Jonathan, rightly said, they're not going anywhere. They're a little bit they're less than half of the population, that they control the resources and the land and the movement and everything else that goes with it. And the regime that was established in 1948 did several things. It cut off Palestine from its existence. And so if we refer, I like to refer to Nur Masalha's book, Palestine, a 4,000-year history. It cut off that history completely. And from the 15th of May, 1948, there was no more Palestine. There was no more a history of Palestine. It suddenly became Israel. And the history of Israel was connected to the biblical mythology. And nothing that happened in between was of any significance. In other words, the entire history of Palestine, thousands of year history, became a historical footnote. And what replaced it very successfully, excuse me, as a result of a very, very successful Zionist propaganda campaign, is connecting the Zionists today to the ancient biblical Hebrews. And that's it, and that's all that matters. And that's what allowed Israel also to go and destroy, for the last 75 years, destroy monuments, destroy mosques, either destroy or allow them to fall into disrepair. And to make sure that around the world, the history of that country is taught based on the Zionist, in a way that conforms with the Zionist narrative. So, even Palestinians, you talk to many Palestinians today, who is Zahir al-Omar? They've never heard of Zahir al-Omar, who was an incredibly important Palestinian leader who governed all of Palestine throughout the 18th century. You talk about many things, by the way, that are mentioned in Nur Masalha's book, The 4,000-Year History, and so on. All the people know, all the people learn that there was this Jewish kingdom, and now the Jews are back. And I think that's a terrible, terrible thing. And as we look at the country itself and the historical monuments that are being destroyed, we see that there's a pattern. And this is now particularly poignant particularly around the old city of Jerusalem, as they destroy monuments, they desecrate and destroy mosques and churches and ancient cemeteries that prove and show clearly that Palestinians have existed in this land for thousands of years, and that there's a very distinct history to that land, which is the Palestinian history. So we have on the one hand this larger issue of the Zionists taking over the narrative, winning the propaganda war in a huge way, so that people refer to this country as Israel. 9 times out of 10, if you walk down the street, you say to somebody, I'm from Palestine, they go, Pakistan? You say, no, Israel. They go, oh, Israel. Yes, of course, we love Israel. That's the conversation, 9 times out of 10, if you talk to people just, that you meet randomly. The other issue is that Israel is people like to talk about the status quo, and I think that's because there is no strong voice for for the Palestinian issues in any really Western capital, but certainly not in Washington, D.C. And so nobody really knows what the issues are. From time to time, we hear about a settlement project. From time to time, there are Qassam rockets and Israel bombs Gaza. But there's no clear vision, there's no clear idea, there's no clear discussion on the major issues. The word apartheid came up recently, so now people use the word apartheid. There's nothing new about apartheid. Israel established an apartheid regime in 1948, clearly and almost by its own definition. They saw nothing wrong with it, and neither did anybody else, obviously, who supported the state of Israel. So day by day, I was in Palestine twice over the last couple of months, or last few months. So on the one hand, we see this enormous, heroic uprising that took place in May. We see Palestinians being punished heavily for this. We saw that all of Palestine was a single country in May because Palestinians rose everywhere, in Lid, in Ramle, in Jaffa, in Haifa, in Be'er-Saba, in the Naqab, in Nasra, of course, in Jerusalem, and everywhere else. And everybody raised the Palestinian flag. And so they broke out, they tore away this definition, which is an Israeli definition of West Bank, Gaza, 1948, Jerusalem, Christians, Muslims, Bedouin, and so forth. There was a single nation that was standing up. They are being punished heavily to this day, these young Palestinian activists. Thousands of them were arrested, many of them charged with security as breaching security issues. In other words, it's very serious charges, and they go through the same torture, they go through the same interrogations and so forth in the Shabak dungeons, like Palestinians everywhere else. And where's the conversation about this? Where's the discussion about this? Israel bombed Gaza, as we know very well, during the month of May, and people in Gaza that I spoke to while the bombs were falling during the attack were saying, we've never experienced anything so severe. Now, knowing just how severe life has been and how severe Israel has been attacking Gaza for the last 70 years, to say that they've never seen anything so severe is beyond belief, is more horrifying than we can imagine. How much more horrifying can it be? And where's the conversation about that? Why is Israel doing that? Why is there no discussion about creating a no-fly zone over Gaza? Why is Israel allowed to do this? There were a lot of protests after the fact, unprecedented numbers around the world, but it was too late. It was too late because the people were already killed. The results of the bombing, that's it. We can't undo that. We can't bring those people to life. The protests should have been there, and an ongoing campaign should be there in place all the time to make sure that Israel does not receive not a single bullet, not a single gun, not a single warplane anymore, ever again. Not a single dollar from any country in the West, not from Germany, not from the UK, not from the United States, not ever again. There needs to be an ongoing campaign to impose severe sanctions on the state of Israel. So the vision of a single democracy in Palestine, I believe, is a vision that is that is realistic. I don't think it's utopian. I think it's realistic. I think it's definitely possible, but it's not going to happen if we wait for somebody to do it. It's not going to happen unless there's serious, concerted effort of supporting the Palestinian resistance and seeing this as resistance. Because we're not talking about somehow making peace with a particular entity that exists in Palestine. In order for there to be a democracy where Israelis and Palestinians can live as equal citizens with a single, one person, one vote, without the Israeli privilege, so that Palestinians who live in Jerusalem and I know Palestinians whose families are almost as old as the Nuseibah family, 500 years, 800 years of recorded history in Jerusalem, they can't go back because like Munir was saying, their status was taken away because they came and they decided to live in America and they took their center of life from there to somewhere else. I took my center of life somewhere else a long time ago. I can go back to Jerusalem tomorrow and live there. No problem. So I think we have to recognize just how severe the situation is. We have to recognize how hard we have to work and what we need to do. And then if we truly are willing to accept that, then we can all work together in order to, as some of my ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionist friends say, peacefully dismantle the Zionist state and bring about a democracy with a one person, one vote with equal rights. But I think it's really, really important to be aware of all of these different issues for which we must stand. And that will never happen unless people of conscience around the world stand up and actually demand that they happen. There has to be a constant demand. Anybody who lives in the United States or Europe or wherever there is that you can actually approach your elected officials and demand that elected officials distance themselves from Zionism completely. That they distance themselves from the state of Israel, that they reject Israel and reject Zionism and demand sanctions. That they demand that Israel not be allowed to participate in the Olympics or other sporting events, or now the Miss Universe pageant is going to be in Israel. There should be no participants. No country should send participants to an event that is being hosted by Israel. In the 2021 Olympics in Tokyo, a judo practitioner from Algeria stood up and said, no, I'm not going to compete against an Israeli. He ruined his career. He was a young athlete, and we can only imagine how hard he must have worked to get to the Olympics. He said no. And he is banned from competing in judo now, not just the Olympics, but judo at all for the next 10 years, which means his career is over. So if the Olympic Committee won't ban Israel, athletes need to ban Israel by saying we will not participate. So once again, the goal of reaching this place where Israelis and Palestinians live as equals in a free, democratic Palestine should be something that I believe all people of conscience should strive for. At the same time, we can't sit around and be complacent about the fact that there is this ongoing brutal campaign taking place in Palestine to destroy any sign, to destroy any monument, to destroy any symbol of Palestinian history, make sure that nobody teaches it and make sure that nobody talks about it, and make sure there's nothing exists but these biblical sites and these biblical parks and so forth. And the killing and detaining and the torture of Palestinians on a regular basis. And Israeli Prime Minister, you know, he was in Glasgow, he came to the United States, he travels around the world. What more needs to happen so that these politicians, so that the state of Israel, so the representatives of the state of Israel are treated the way they should be, which is like, you know, representatives of a racist, brutal regime. And so this is not an easy struggle. It's the right struggle. I think it's a struggle that has a very good chance of success. I think it's a struggle that people can understand. But because the Zionists are so far ahead of us, and us, I mean anybody who believes in justice for Palestine, who cares about Palestine, because the Zionists are so far ahead, we need to really ramp up our game. We need to be 1,000 times more aggressive. We need to work 1,000 times harder. We need to make sure that our friends and our neighbors, you know, I hear this all the time. Well, you know, my son-in-law is Jewish, so I don't like to bring this up. Or my neighbor or my good friend is Jewish. What's that got to do with anything? Why not bring it up? Bring it up. Just because they're Jewish, that means they have to support this travesty? I know countless of Jewish people, entire Jewish communities who oppose Zionism, have always opposed Zionism. You know, like the largest anti-Zionist Jewish community in the world. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, are descendants of survivors of Auschwitz. This is the ultra-Orthodox community here in New York. The entire community are descendants of survivors of Auschwitz who came from Hungary, who came to America with nothing. And now it's a huge, huge community. And it's an anti-Zionist community completely. So what's the problem about opposing Zionism, and why is opposing Zionism somehow anti-Semitic? Just the notion of claiming that opposing Zionism is anti-Semitic is an insult to anyone who ever suffered from racism or anti-Semitism. It's an insult to say something like this. And so this is all part of a bigger picture. This is to say this is all part of a larger picture. There are many components here, and we have to realize all these components, and then we have to put them together into a concerted effort, a concerted struggle, a clear strategy that will defeat what is now the state of Israel. You know, people don't like to talk about, you know, the Palestinians resorting to armed resistance. People don't like about Hamas shooting rockets. When I went to Palestine in May, I had a ticket flying into Tel Aviv, but none of the airlines, all the flights were canceled to Tel Aviv, so I had to go through Amman, which is fine. Why was the airport, the major airport of the state of Israel, closed for 10 days or 2 weeks? Because of the Qassam rockets. Now, had we done our job, flights would not be going to Tel Aviv because there would be a boycott. Tel Aviv would have been desolate because of the boycott. But because we don't do our job, it's up to the Palestinians to do it, and this is what they did. And then we're surprised that people go, wow, look at Hamas, look at their accomplishments. It's an accomplishment. When they managed to close Israeli, to create a reality where flights do not want to land in Tel Aviv airport, that is an accomplishment. You know, that's a very important accomplishment. It can be done otherwise. It doesn't have to be rockets. It's just a lot of work, and it means that we all have to get off our seats and actually do something to make sure that any airline that flies to Tel Aviv is boycotted. So again, it's another example of the types of things that we need to do. Make sure that Israel is not welcome, is not invited, and if it is invited, that people won't participate. Won't engage with Israeli teams, won't engage with Israeli academics, won't engage with Israeli representatives of Israeli cultural events and so forth. Never mind, politicians and diplomats should all be kicked out. This is the reality that we need to strive for, because that is what will bring about the transformation that we want. That will be the reality. Why, you know, an excellent book came out talking about refugees and the Palestinian refugees in international law. I did a webinar with the two people who wrote the book. It was excellent. You know, it's on my website on mikopeled.com. It's an incredible book. People like to say that the Zionists came and made the desert bloom. That's nonsense. They came and they stole a country that was in full bloom. They stole money in the banks. They stole the produce from the fields. They stole a country that was thriving, a country that was exporting barley. Palestinians were exporting barley to the UK for beer. They were exporting cotton to the UK for the textile. They were exporting olive oil. It was a thriving country. There were cities and towns and villages. The Zionists made the desert bloom? Look at the destruction. Like Roman legions going to the country, destroying olive groves, destroying cities, destroying ancient monuments and villages and towns, and not to mention trying to destroy an entire nation and entire people. So it's a tough struggle. It's a tough uphill struggle. It's the right struggle. It can only be accomplished, I believe, if we are fully aware of the difficulties of the reality and what needs to be done. It's only going to, I believe, happen if we gear up for a tough struggle, if we demanded elected officials, and here in the United States, it doesn't matter if people are running for school board or for national office, they should distance themselves from Zionism before anybody gives them a vote. Then there can be a very bright future for Palestine. That history that was cut off on May 15th, 1948, and has been left to dry and almost die for the last 75 years can be brought back, can be revived. We need to hope that the destruction that's going to happen between now and when that point happens, when we actually get up and do our work and we can see results, is not irreversible. Al-Aqsa is next. There's no question that destroying Al-Aqsa and building a temple is part of the national Zionist Israeli project. There's no question about that. It's not a bunch of religious fanatics. It is part and parcel of the Zionist national project to destroy Al-Aqsa and build a so-called Jewish temple. I remember learning, folk songs as a kid, singing about the day that the temple will be rebuilt and we will rebuild the temple, and we were not religious people at all. And this, famous song, Jerusalem of Gold, talks about it, and so on and so forth. So I think this is, we need to act, and we need to act fast, because Palestine is burning, and it's burning fast. And Israel is not going to stop unless it is absolutely forced to do so. And when we are able, and if we are able to do this, if we do gear up, then absolutely the democratic, free democratic Palestine, a clear clear, democratic, free Palestine, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, from the northern borders with Lebanon to the Gulf of Aqaba, can be a wonderful, free, democratic state. But we are going to have to get up, and we are going to have to make it happen, and to support our Palestinian friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Miko. Thank you, Miko. Very inspiring as well. Hopefully we'll come out with some action points after we listen to everyone. Thank you very much. We'll move on to Jeff Halper now. Jeff is the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolition, ICAD, and a founding member of One Democratic State campaign. I had the pleasure to meet with you, Jeff, a couple of years ago when I spent a summer at Birzeit University. Jeff authored War Against the People, Israel, the Palestinians, and the Global Pacification, and Israel in Palestine, my first book of Jeff's, and Obstacles to Peace. In his latest book, Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State, he argues that the only way out of a colonial situation is the dismantling of Zionist structures of domination, something that resonates with what the speakers have said, and the replacement of these structures by a single democratic state. In that state, all Palestinians and Israeli Jews would force a new civil society and a shared political community through a 10-point program of the One Democratic State campaign. Welcome, Jeff. Thank you for joining us. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Thanks. Thank you all for inviting me. I came in a little bit late, so I didn't hear Munir's presentation, but Munir and I are both members of the One Democratic State campaign. And I think this is a very significant, I mean, we're just beginning, and you know, it's just starting. So we're not a major campaign yet. But this is, I think, a significant initiative because over all the years that we've been activists for Palestine and against the occupation and all of that, the big thing we've been missing is a political program. In other words, as Jonathan said, we had a political program for many years, and that was the two-state idea that the Israeli left supported. We weren't too crazy about the idea. It wasn't a fair and just solution. But, you know, if Arafat accepted it in 1988, and if the PLO accepted it, you know, we can't be holier than the Pope. This is basically a Palestinian struggle, and we had to respect that. But certainly it's been clear, I think, to everyone over the last 10, if not 20 years, that the two-state solution not only is dead, but it never was. And this gets into, I think, a very important part of the One Democratic State campaign's analysis. And that is that Zionism was a settler colonial movement. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle because settler colonialism isn't just another slogan. It reframes fundamentally what we mean by Zionism. The problem is that we've misanalyzed, not only we, but governments have misanalyzed this situation for decades. And therefore, you know, all the attempts to do conflict resolution and negotiations and compromise have come to naught because they're not dealing, you can't compromise and negotiate and apply a conflict resolution model to a colonial situation. It's like putting a round peg in a square hole. So to begin our analysis, to understand what in the hell we're talking about, what we have to dismantle, what we have to decolonize, we have to see Zionism as a settler colonial movement. And that means there is no conflict. We have to stop using the word conflict. And in my view, using terms like both sides, because settler colonialism, whether it's in the US or Canada or South Africa or Australia or New Zealand or many other places in the world, in Algeria, in Mozambique, in Angola, there's many examples, Kenya. Settler colonialism, like colonialism itself, is a unilateral movement. It's not coming to ask permission of the native population. Can we settle in this country? Can we live with you at peace? Can we accommodate? No, the native population is irrelevant. It doesn't count. In Zionism, you know, when once in a while someone would say, hey, wait a minute, but what about the Arabs? Because Zionism had a completely self-contained narrative that had nothing only to do with Jews and had nothing to do with Palestinians. The question is, well, we're not dealing with that right now. And it was called in Zionism, this is the official term, it was called the hidden question. So Zionism as a settler colonial movement had one goal, and that was to Judaize. This is a term we don't use often, but this is a key term, to Judaize Palestine. In other words, to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country, to transform Palestine into the land of Israel. Not 78% of it, but all of it, as we can see now from Israeli policies, from the Mediterranean, at least to the Jordan River. I mean, there were some maximalists like Jabotinsky and others that thought Jordan was also a part of the land of Israel, but they were willing to compromise. That was the only compromise Zionism was willing to make at the Jordan River. But this whole country was then claimed, because every settler colonial movement invents a narrative of why the country we're targeting belongs to us and doesn't belong to the indigenous population. The narrative often has to do with religion, of course. It has to do with manifest destiny. It has to do with the fact that they're primitive and we're bringing civilization. I mean, there's 1,001 different, every settler colonial movement makes up its own narrative. And ours, of course, was based largely on the Bible, as Miko said. But nevertheless, it was a self-contained narrative that had nothing to do with Palestinians. And it was a narrative that said this entire country is the land of Israel and it belongs exclusively to us. And this is a basic element of Zionism that is true until today. You can see it in Israeli policy. So that since this was a unilateral colonial movement intending to Judaize and take over the entire country of Palestine, we can't call this a conflict. This isn't the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Conflicts have two sides. Conflicts are when two or more sides fight about something, and then they have to resolve it, and they go into conflict resolution, and they have negotiations, and they compromise and find some deal. There is no deal with Zionism. With Zionism, there is one set purpose, and this is the whole point of it, and that is to Judaize and take over the entire land of Israel. And unless we understand that fundamental point, that fundamental reality of Zionism and of the state of Israel, we're misanalyzing. That's why the two-state solution discussion that still goes on is so destructive, because it isn't only that it's not going to happen, it's that they don't understand the fundamental logic of Zionism that leads to one particular place. So if conflict resolution can't resolve this, then what does? Well, you resolve every colonial movement with decolonization. This is the term we should be using, decolonization, which means basically dismantling all the structures of control and domination that Zionism has managed to impose on the Palestinian population, of privilege as well, and then what? You see, now this is the problem we have. We're very strong, we're protesting, we're resisting, we're doing all kinds of things, but you can't be in a political struggle without a political program. We've managed, I think, to make Palestine into a global issue. I think that's on the level of the anti-apartheid struggle all over the world. We've managed to mobilize the international civil society. We have managed to do that, but we've left them hanging because, all right, you can do BDS, you can boycott Ben & Jerry's and Caterpillar and Hewlett-Packard. You can have campaigns, you can do lobbying in your parliaments, you can do this, you can do that. But what are we BDSing for? What are we protesting for? What's our program? You can't just end Zionism and end Israel and get to a just peace on the basis of a negative protest campaign. You have to present an alternative workable, just resolution, which I think Munir probably talked about. I missed that, Munir, but I rely on you that you talked about that. And in fact, I think the significant part of our movement, the One Democratic State campaign, is that we sat down for a couple of years, Palestinians and Israeli Jews, and I say Israeli Jews because there are many Israelis that aren't Jews, there are Israeli Palestinians or Palestinian citizens of Israel. Israeli Jews and Palestinians sat down and we formulated, I think, a very solid, workable, just 10-point political program. And I put up at the beginning of the chat line here, the website, our website reference to our 10-point campaign. So the 10-point campaign, I won't go into the details, of course, and I'll end it, I want to end in a minute. It basically envisions then the decolonization of Zionism, the creation of one shared state, of course, a democracy, one person, not a confederation, not binational, not some convoluted thing, a straightforward democratic state. One person, one vote, one parliament, one citizenship, one legal system in which we all live in, that nevertheless guarantees not only the individual rights of all its citizens. So our fundamental revolution is we're reconstructing a state that's based on ethno-nationalism and religion into a state that's based on citizenship, which shouldn't be such a hard sell, you would think, in Canada, North America, in the United States, Europe. I mean, we want a democratic state, one person, one vote, that nevertheless guarantees the collective identities of all the peoples living in the country. We can't ignore the fact that there's a Palestinian nationalism. There's an Israeli nationalism. I mean, we can be against Zionism, but that doesn't mean it's going to disappear. The point is, you can be anything you want to be. You can be religious, you can have your ideology, you can have your rituals, your institutions, whatever, like in any pluralistic society, as long as they're expressed within the framework of a democratic state. And the truly hopeful, and not just hopeful, I think the truly, well, all right, I'll stay with hopeful. I can't think of another word. I hate the word hopeful, but never mind. It's a very anti-political word. But I think the real vision that we have is that once this state is created, a common state, a common civil society, the dynamics of everyday life, of living together, because you can live anywhere you want in the country. You participate in the economy. We have, of course, the refugees return. That's crucial. And the refugees return not only because they have a right to return, but because there are citizens. The fact that you're driven out of the country, or you even leave the country voluntarily in a war, doesn't negate your civil status. You remain a citizen. And since our new country is based on citizenship of everyone living in this country today, plus the refugees, we want an ingathering of our citizens. And so the return of the refugees, of course, is not only, it makes sense and it's a fundamental issue. But I think the real part of the vision that's really important, and I'll end on this, is that I think actually over less than half a generation, with young people who move on very quickly. Young people don't get stuck on the old, and I think you know, our struggle is going to become an old thing, like the anti-apartheid struggle is an old thing today in South Africa. Mandela is some historical figure that's already gone into the mists among young people in South Africa. The good news is that young people move on, and I think what will emerge fairly quickly is a common political community. A political community means that there's a new us. It doesn't neutralize your Palestinian identity, your religious identity, your Israeli identity, if you want to hang on to that, but it creates a new us created by this civil society that generates a new political community. And let me end just with one little tiny example that shows how this could happen. You know, in this part of the world, football or soccer, as it's called in North America, is a big thing. I mean, the World Cup is 1,000 times bigger than the Super Bowl. Israel, first of all, the Palestinian football team has a higher international ranking than the Israeli football team does. But neither of us have managed to get into the World Cup. Imagine just in the, again, this is the force of everyday life, that combining our best players, our national team of whatever this new country is going to be called, we don't have a name for it yet, gets into the World Cup. Can you imagine how that would galvanize it? It's our team. And our means our in the sense of a civil identity of the new country that we're in. It transcends the particular identities that we still hold that are important to us, our ethnic, national, religious identities and so on. But there's one, it goes a step further and it transcends it all. And there's a new political community that emerges. So what I'm trying to suggest is that I think this 10-point program shows a way forward. It's very political, but the point I want to urge on everyone is we have to have a political program that guides our movement. I think we've mobilized the international civil society, like I've said, but we left them hanging. What are we BDSing for? What's our program? You can't, if you went to Parliament or you go to Congress and you're asked, well, what do you want? What are you going to say? It's not enough to say end the occupation. It's not enough to go into a harangue about apartheid. You have to say, we have to talk in political terms. We want, and here's our program, and let's build on it. I think our movement, the One Democratic State campaign, is beginning to build a base among Palestinians. That's the first stage. And then, we have to go to the international civil society with this political program. So that's the piece that's been missing. That's what we're trying to insert into this struggle. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. And I like the fact that everyone is bringing a lot of points of action. So we have people fighting on the grounds for the rights of Palestinians every day, writing books that we can get from the internet with very, very specific things to do, the BDS campaign, the political program, and so on. And we continue building strength. And I'm going to do my best to bring the questions that people are sending through the chat, but if I miss it for some reason, please feel free to bring it up. We will have our last speaker, Lamis Deek. I hope I'm not destroying your last name, Lamis. Lamis is an internationally practicing attorney who engages in litigation, compliance, and policy work related to human rights, corruption, commercial and charitable activity. Lamis is based in New York and has litigated and crafted policies to protect against anti-Muslim, Arab, and anti-Palestinian state institutional practices in the US and abroad. If I may add, right here in Canada, we have a lot of those. Lamis also advises on and has litigated invalid manufactured terrorism case, attempted shutdowns of mosques, and so on. She collaborates with several national and international legal groups and is the co-convener of the Palestinian Assembly for Liberation. Welcome, Lamis. Take it away, please.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Jeff, for your very impassioned interjection. Jonathan, Munir, and Miko, it's good to see you all. Thank you, Radhika and Claudia, for setting this up. I was typing in and I didn't want to send it. So, I might veer and offer some different perspectives. I am going to start, and I don't say this to establish any kind of brownie points, but I'm also a long time one of the early members of Al-Haq, the Palestine Right to Return Coalition. And the Right to Return Coalition, Al-Haq, has been for 22 years advancing a political program that centered and focused specifically on the one-state solution. Now, what happened is that over the years, many of the people who've come to be perceived as the dominant voices in the Palestinian solidarity movement had been, for the first at least 15 to 16 years of our life as Palestinian organizers and a Palestinian-led international organization, had spent quite a good amount of their resources as they were coming into the movement as allies or as conflictual allies early on, had spent a significant amount of their resources demonizing, erasing, silencing, and making more vulnerable Palestinians like myself and Palestinian organizations like Al-Quds, to where we've gotten to the point where we didn't just face, you know, these kind of civil society responses and penalties, but we were subject to criminalization. But it's important that people are very well aware of this history and aware of the fact that Palestinians, the majority of whom live outside of Palestine, have had this political program for decades, but have been drowned out by more powerful forces within our movement and, of course, outside of the movement. That doesn't require detail. To that end, I also want to just bring everybody's attention to what I just typed up in the chat, which is our political program and our Declaration of Founding Principles of the Palestinian Assembly for Liberation, which incorporates much of what's been brought to the table by those who spoke before me, but is actually quite a bit more advanced. So we've never, in the Palestinian-led segment of the Palestinian liberation struggle outside of Palestine, really presented or maneuvered or proceeded without having this political program. And all of this is to say that it's important to look at the Palestinian organizers and organizations in the US and globally and see what they're offering and see what their history is, because we're not just offering it and here to say, hey, 22 years later, we're right. We're not just here to say, hey, we've been the vanguards, but what we are saying is we've been considering this, and not only are we considering this, but now we're discussing the very details of this, part of which I really hope, it's a lengthy document, I really hope people, especially those in the 1DS group, you know, and I'm in contact with Ubay, Jeff, and we love your work. So there's a lot of, you know, overlap and coordination happening, but, you know, please have a look at that, because we actually go into everything from what, you know, sustainable return looks like, to what rebuilding our communities looks like, to what reunification looks like, Palestinian reunification. And I want to also begin by clarifying that Palestine, the Palestinian nation certainly is not just limited to the boundaries of colonized Palestine, all of colonized Palestine, but it exists beyond those. And in the Palestinian nation, globally, the Palestinian national body, as we refer to it, and that we are the majority of Palestinians. And so our perspectives, our objectives, our goals, our privilege to be able to determine and think through these issues for the minutia of them needs to not be underestimated by our allies in the Palestinian solidarity movement. So the majority of Palestinians, I think, have been thinking about this and working on it. Now, not everything has stuck, not everything has succeeded. And we're grateful that people are coming into the understanding that one state is the only possible solution, right? Because essentially what we're saying is what Jeff said, which is decolonization is the only logical and sustainable solution, or some of, you know, not everybody who says one state really means decolonization, and I'll address that in a little bit. And we're glad that people are catching up and that this is entering the mainstream. So what I'd also like to offer is that Palestinians are working through the details of this, and we're running ahead, and we're not waiting, and we're not interested in waiting for people to determine what that one liberated state looks like. And I'll address that. I'll address probably what it shouldn't look like. What we're doing is we're finishing the sentence. We started, right? We started with what everybody else has addressed, which is with a bloody, violent, supremacist colonization and genocide. What we want is one state in all of colonized Palestine, and what does it look like? And I'm going to talk about what might be a little bit jarring to some, and I'll explain why, what it does not and what it cannot and what it should not look like, and what will not be sustainable. And that is binationalism, that is not sustainable. Neoliberal Western formulations of democracy, that is not sustainable. And it does not look like beginning with a one person, one vote. There are many steps that need to happen before that and in between them. One other thing I'd like to clarify is that the Palestinian liberation struggle, the Palestinian solidarity movement, that we talk about making all of these gains, made these gains directly through the sacrifices that Palestinians have made, not just on the ground in Gaza and the West Bank, but in the refugee camps across the Arab region. And it's important that we understand that. And I start with this framing because this shapes our understanding of what we mean when we say we are building towards decolonization, towards full justice, and towards one state. That these are critical calculations that we make that become not just symbolic and rhetoric in terms of how do we resolve and undo and reverse injustices, but really give us an understanding of what does it require to build sustainable peace, right? Sustainable, quote unquote, conflict, sustainable, enduring conflict resolution that doesn't just work for Palestine, but works for the region and therefore globally. And I'll tie this in together shortly. So, excuse me. The other thing I'd like us to consider, especially for those in the solidarity movements, is how do we avoid falling into this cycle of where Palestinians are pushing the line. Palestinians are saying this is what we want, and it takes 20 years. This is a constant pattern, right, that we're falling into. Palestinians are saying this is what liberation looks like. This is what justice looks like. And then it takes 20 years later for the world to catch up. And what that requires is that people really understand the totality of Palestinian humanity, the totality of the Palestinian national body, and the totality of Palestinian grievances, injustices, to understand and appreciate the value and knowledge and wisdom of the Palestinian vision for liberation, and even the Palestinian vision for democracy, not just as abstractions, right, but as goals to reach through tangible methods of implementation. That is what's required of all of us, myself included, but certainly those in the Palestinian solidarity movement, a vision for implementation that is grounded in reality, and that is the Palestinian reality, not just of the Palestinian individual, but the reality of the Palestinian collective, right? So Palestinian life as a whole, right? And that's cultural, it's historic, it's psychological, it's environmental, it's agricultural, it's financial, it's tribal, it's religious, and it's regional. And it is one that is organically tied to its Arabness, right? Meaning the region, and this is how it ties into the globe. And all these aspects have been brutally assaulted where they have not almost been killed, if not killed, whereas we see several million folks like Justin, aka Yaakov Fauci, who's taking the Palestinian family home. And so how do we operate within a paradigm where we have these grave, as Jonathan repeatedly says, lack of parity, this imbalance of power? And how do we then come in and say, oh yes, one state and all of us, you Justin and you Ahmed in the refugee camps in Lebanon, now you all have one state. That is not sustainable. It is not just, it is not fair. It does not resolve grievances, and unresolved grievances means no peace, right? It means no stability, right? So representation and the ballot alone is abjectly wholly insufficient. because it doesn't resolve the legacy of violence, the legacy of theft, because it's not just the taking of the home, but it's what the taking of the home and the taking of the tree and the taking of the airport and the taking of the factory means for the children, right? In terms of their intellectual development, in terms of their opportunities in life, in terms of where they've ended up and where they would be going. So this legacy of violence is not resolved by representation. It's not resolved by a ballot. And that becomes important, not just for Palestinians, the primary measure and the primary important for the region and therefore the globe. So those of us who've been on the front lines of considering this, and it says my internet connection is unstable. Are you all hearing me well?
We lost you a couple of times.
So sorry.
Just briefly though, so continue.
Yeah, sure. So this begs the question of what do we mean and what is needed of us when we say one state? And my response is to say one state now, especially now that it's come into the mainstream, and we're all very excited and grateful 22 years later that it's come into the mainstream. But what we're also saying is to say one state is not sufficient for us. And we need to understand and speak in these details that everybody's alluding to, that I hope we've addressed in part in the PAL Assembly Founding Principles document, that peace building and democratization are not just insufficient, but they can be woefully and tragically detrimental to Palestinian interests, Palestinian justice, and the reversal of Palestinian losses and traumas. Why? Because it assumes a rearrangement of political and social order within the existing frameworks. It assumes moving forward within existing economic, social, and legal frameworks. Every advance in rights for a Palestinian, if we are to operate just based on this idea of one state means equal representation and equal access to the ballot, even if that access to the ballot were to include all Palestinians all over the world, the majority of whom are outside of Palestine, every advance in rights starts as a losing struggle, and it relies on the consent of Zionists who are very heavily invested in the disempowerment and the structures of oppression and supremacy that exist, right? And it really assumes a very neoliberal, neo-colonial process. And the prime example of what that looks like is in the Palestinian Authority. So again, even in the casually tossed around term of binationalism, what we hear oftentimes, what we're not thinking about is how, when we're not deconstructing these things and finishing the sentence, we risk entrenching the very structures that we should be working to dismantle, the structures of Zionist colonization, the structures of Zionism, be they social, cultural, religious, legal, all of them, right? So when we talk about these things without completing the sentences, we risk endangering Palestinians in a new way, right? Subjecting them to new and in other ways more powerful forms and systems of oppression. So what's needed, right? What's needed is meaningful justice, sustainable peace, enduring cohabitation. All of this relies on the de-Zionization and the decolonization and the liberation, not just of Palestinian lands, but of the Palestinian national body. And this is required of us before we reach the issue of representation and voting. It requires that we work collectively, and I'm going to keep referring to the Palestinian founding documents because it took us a long time to kind of deconstruct what has happened, and what has happened to the Palestinians is in fact really novel. We are in many ways, unfortunately, a unique experiment in the way that we have been fragmented and treated, especially vis-a-vis the NGOization and this fragmentation and the waging of the PA on us. So what we need is to rebuild not new, using from the old, but rebuild new legal, political, social norms that reverse and do not reproduce and extend existing systems and structures of oppression of any sort, right? It requires that we revive and we center and we prioritize indigenous Palestinian knowledge, practices, and ownership of power, right? So what this means when we look at democracy, or the common dominant understanding of what democracy is these days is based on what the West has waged against the rest of the world. What Palestinians and Arabs and people in the African continent and the global South have always known is that a healthy democracy, sustainable democracy, truly inclusive democracy does not look like the Western version, but looks like one that is grounded and accountable to the community level, looks like one that understands a value system and has connected to that value system another mechanism of honor and shame when that value system is broken, incorporates indigenous practices of this mechanism of accountability and this mechanism of restoration, right? So this kind of understanding and prioritizing and reviving, because what's happened with Zionism and Zionist colonization and genocide and fragmentation and strowing us about the four corners of the world is that this has been erased, right? This has not been allowed to develop and be implemented. And part of what we are working in, you see with the PAL founding documents, is how do we revive that and begin to apply, how do we protect, preserve, revive, and begin to apply it to our current conditions, restoring a healthy society, of course, dismantling Zionist mythology to the fullest extent, not just the frameworks of Zionist mythology, all of them, and understanding that Palestinians are not a tabula rasa. We are a very rich history and a very rich part of global society. If you look at what Palestinians have achieved even under colonization and facing constant, imminent, incremental genocide, or whatever you want to call it, a version of genocide, the Palestinian society is very rich. We talk about, can Palestine be a democratic state? Oh my God, if you look at what Palestinians are, we are one of the richest, most clear, transparent, loudest articulations of democratic will. And the highest articulation of Palestinian democratic will is found in the Palestinian liberation struggle, which is not just in Palestine, but global. In our liberation struggle, you find the most multicultural, multi-party, pluralistic, multi-gender, multi-generational democratic manifestation, I think that exists in the world, to be quite frank, right? And we do this with a civility that other struggles, including those in the Arab Spring, have attempted to emulate, that we've gone and discussed. Well, how do we have a household of 50 different people and parties in one organization, and we maintain these united fronts, these visions? How do we deal with, how do we respect our differences? How do we elevate even our cultural differences, our dialectic differences, all of these things? So this brings us back to, what do we do? What did I just say? The Palestinian liberation struggle, which has long called for these, dating back to the PLO initial principles, which were diluted and liquidated in large part by the Palestinian Authority, have been making these demands for a very long time. We are not new to the concept of democracy. We manifest it quite brilliantly and effectively. So if we want to understand what we do, what we must do is prioritize and listen to the Palestinian liberation struggle, whether it's in Gaza at the Great Return March, or Al-Auda in 1999, telling the world one state and return is paramount and critical, not just to Palestinian peace, but to regional peace, and therefore to global peace, by the way. Listen to the Palestinian liberation struggle. Everybody, myself included, is obligated to do that. Number two, if we are to finish the sentence of what does one democratic state looks like, we must in the same breath also call for reparations, because voting in the absence of a remedy of the trauma, of a remedy of the legacy of violence, of a remedy of the legacy of theft, of a remedy or a proposal for what does sustainable return and sustainable democracy looks like, one state must be in the same breath as reparations, right? And return. I'm not mentioning return constantly because I'm assuming everybody understands that that's just basic elemental part of the Palestinian liberation struggle, and any call for justice or liberation or decolonization for Palestine, this is a given. So return, reparations, one state. must be one breath. Now, the issue becomes how do we implement this, right? There are countless UN resolutions, and we were the first issue and the first people about which UN institutions was built, and not a single one was dedicated to the enforcement of Palestinian rights or the enforcement of Palestinian return, and not a single one was dedicated to the protection of Palestinian bodies wherever they may be, right? Because Israel and Zionists kill and murder Palestinians across the world, whether it's in Rome or in Dubai or in Lebanon or in Syria, wherever it is, and in Palestine, not a single institution or agency is responsible or tasked with the protection of Palestinian bodies from Israeli and Zionist violence, which means that it becomes incumbent upon us to elevate in that same sentence and prioritize the need, the immediate demands, and the mobilizations for, right, for the means and mechanisms of Palestinians to be able to not just defend against, but to preempt Israeli and Zionist violence, which is a given. If there's one thing that we can all count on, it's Israeli and Zionist violence against Palestinians, wherever they may be. This needs to enter the mainstream, and this is what we need a political program about, right? Is how do we facilitate the means by which Palestinians can not only protect their bodies, but then affect and themselves, right? Because we talk about self-determination, it doesn't require relying on 5 million other people across the world. We're pretty intelligent people, if I say so myself, but how do we give them the means and mechanisms to protect and implement, right, their own political vision, to protect their own lives? And with this, of course, comes one of the most powerful tools that the US and the Israeli governments have waged against Palestinians in Palestine and globally, which is the terror designations that Jeff and Miko and others, I think, I'm sorry if I'm forgetting who, have alluded to, but people don't really understand how powerful these have been in terms of disabling and disempowering Palestinians globally, not just from defending themselves, but from being able to work and operate as a united mass front. And every moment in Palestinian history that saw any sort of victory was marked by Palestinian unity and coordination. The terrorism designations, their most powerful impact is to not allow us to coordinate and collaborate with each other. And so this becomes as crucial as anything else any of us have said for Palestinian liberation and decolonization. The last thing I'm going to say is that all of these things, we also casually toss around, Israeli settlers this. Settlers are not settlers, respectfully. That's way too casual, and in my opinion, an inappropriate, inaccurate legal term. They are paramilitary agents of a state that is engaged in colonization and genocide. What is their disincentive to engage as agents of a genocidal colonizing state, and oftentimes as paramilitary forces? There really isn't. This demand for reparations, this demand for accountability, whether it's through the ICC, right? All of these things, even rhetorically, because our struggle is not just physical, right? It's political as well, but it's also discursive, right? Words are reality, words create reality. So when we enter the mainstream, and the big mushrooming global solidarity movement in support of the liberation of Palestine is constantly saying reparations, guess what? The next Justin Yaakov Fauci is going to think twice about what reparations he's going to have to pay before he gets on a plane and goes to colonize some lands in Palestine. The last note I want to say is not only do I believe in the power and strength of Palestinians, not because there's anything distinct about us, but our conditions have forced us to always look at solutions for injustices, and that positions our people to be in a kind of position that is constantly thinking about what is best for global morality. But I have the same faith and the same belief in our allies in the Palestinian solidarity movement. It requires just a little bit of not only intellectual creativity, but hard work and a lot of bravery. And it takes so little. It takes a few people saying a few sentences over and over again for this to become normal and to change the world. I thank you all once again, and I look forward to your questions.
Lamis, thank you so much for that fantastic closing of the panel. Let me just apologize that we're not very good at keeping time. When we meet, we tell people 2 hours for these events. It's never been true. They usually take 3 hours. So Thank you for your patience, but it's very hard because, you know, we bring people that have so much to teach us, and we have, you know, they have so much to share with us. I know that some of the speakers have other commitments. So let me just get started with, I'll do my best to follow the order of questions. I had one question by one, I think it was David, who sent it through the internet, through the chat box, and maybe Jonathan, you might want to start elaborating on this or other things that you take away from the panel. I also like to say that I see, you know, some, you know, I see a coherence at the same time, different perspectives on issues. And I personally welcome that. I like debate and I like, you know, disagreement and argument and so on. So we welcome all the perspectives. The question is, and we'll start with Jonathan, but then if others have their contributions, and we'll try to keep them to, you know, a couple of minutes or so we can go over several questions. A democratic transformation depends not only on moral justice, but on internal forces to bring it about. In South Africa, the main force was the Black labor movement. What, in your views, are the internal forces for democratic transformation in Palestine, Israel? So that's the question, Jonathan. I don't know if we want to start, you know, so elaborate on the question or maybe other things that you might want to say. And then, you know, we'll go through the others and see what they have to say.
Yeah. Internal forces, of course, we are talking about both Palestinians and talking about Israeli Jews. For Palestinians, I think it is very important to restore the unity that Lamis mentioned. Palestinians feel very much one people, but they have been fragmented and forced to look at things differently because the regime has fragmented us into 5 different categories. The refugees have concerns. The Gaza people have concerns. The West Bank area A, B, and C have concerns. Those in Jerusalem have separate concerns. Those who have been granted citizenship have other concerns. So unity is one of the most important things for the Palestinians. On the Israeli side, or the Jewish side, we need to come to terms with the trauma, the phobia, as well as the misuse of Holocaust and understanding of security. We need to address it forthrightly because it is a reality that needs to be addressed. We know that it is abused and misused and used as a justification, but many people really genuinely feel it at a very deep psychological traumatic level. There needs to be some attempt to deal with it and to provide healing. I like what Lamis was talking about, the sense of reparation and restorative justice, that there have to be, in our vision of a democratic state, there have to be built-in mechanisms for leveling the playing field, for providing some measure of reparations, restoration, alternative arrangements, particularly if settler colonialists are living in your house. What do? Do you uproot them, or do you provide a mechanism for alternative housing, alternative land, alternative arrangements that restore a healing into the situation rather than allow injustices to fester? These are a few of the mechanisms that we must think through and also fight towards in order to achieve our goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Because of your other commitments, would you like to elaborate maybe on other things that you've heard from the other panelists? And then we'll have, we'll invite the other panelists to build on what you said.
Yes, I think this has been a wonderful panel, very powerful, very deep thoughts have been given, and very new ideas have been created. It is very important to know, to use the right terms, to have the proper vision, to work out as many of the details as possible. But then beyond the vision, you have to start working. You have to start a specific program of action leading towards these things. And we must maintain the hope. We must maintain not only the vision, but also the genuine, deep-seated faith in the proper movement of history towards justice, towards equality, towards restoring and healing a situation that is clearly unacceptable. It's not enough to say it's unacceptable. It's not enough to condemn it. It's not enough to oppose it. We must also present a new vision and work towards the new reality that we all want to arrive at. And we will find a lot of support throughout the world, in both camps and outside, of people who really genuinely are willing to work in this struggle for liberation and justice. And thank you very much for putting on this really wonderful panel.
And thank you, Jonathan, for an honor to have you on the panel. Maybe Munir, who came in, back a couple of hours ago almost, and actually, Munir, you're there. You're actually there right now. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. Jeff is also there too. But maybe you folks would like to, maybe something to build on, or maybe debate, for, against, etc., building on Jonathan's and addressing this question. Munir, let's start with Munir. You're in Al-Quds, Munir, right?
Yes, I am. I am in Al-Quds. I am in Al-Quds. Yes, I believe we have a lot of forces that are working towards justice here. Not all of them are necessarily focused on the goal we are debating today. The goal that we are debating today, unfortunately, has been alienated by this ongoing imagination and wahm. How do you say wahm? Mean better يساعدني. Okay.
Jeff can help, or
yeah, it's okay. Of the peace process. Illusion. Yes, illusion of the peace process. So yes, we have several forces that are directly and clearly working for one democratic state, but many other forces are working on different elements that would lead to this. Anybody working for democracy, real democracy, any person working for human rights in a fundamental way. You know, there are the human rights that are about a violation here and there, but there are more the human rights that look fundamentally at the real issues and the stem that from which or the roots from which the whole problem stems. These people, I think, are making great contributions. And they exist on both sides. They do exist on the Palestinian side, they do exist on the Israeli side. However, I believe that we need, and this is maybe, I might be echoing Jeff here, that we need to work on more organization and trying as much as possible. I see on a daily basis many people who actually believe that there is, there is nothing in this two-state solution paradigm that we have been forced into by Britain, later the United Nations, and every diplomat now who every time they give a speech in Jerusalem, and I meet diplomats a lot because of my job in the human rights field, they always say the only solution is a two-state solution. We are supporting human rights because we believe in two-state solution. We are supporting this because, they always keep convincing us, the diplomats representing their states, that this is the only thing that works. I don't believe this is true. And we need to claim our cause again by organizing ourselves better and just finding all these advocates for real democracy, real liberation, real justice, to start working for an end goal. So we still have a long time to go, I believe, in this organization. However, I think it's inevitable that it's coming. I do think it's inevitable. There is no way that the lie of the two-state solution that has been used since 80s, 90s can continue forever. It has been abused enough. It has been exhausted enough, and it's over. So now, and that's, I'm not a political person, by the way. I've never been interested in being politically active. And that has a background of where I come from, and the history and the risks of being involved in politics, and also not being convinced, to be honest with you, of all the ideologies that I saw around me from all the political actors that are available around me. However, I believe that at least this, this specific goal is one goal that one can start working for, even if it is direct involvement in politics and not in merely human rights, even though, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Munir. Thank you. Maybe Jeff, and then maybe we can have Miko and Lamis elaborate on this point of what are the internal forces in tension and at work towards the struggle for democracy in Palestine.
Well, the Palestinians, I mean, I can't obviously represent the Palestinians. As Munir says, are in a very difficult situation. I don't think there's any opposition to the idea of a single state, whatever that means. And that was the PLO's position for many years. As Lamis says, that was their founding position until the late 70s and into the 80s and ending in 1988. But Israel has a policy I've written about, a policy of despair, of simply making Palestinian lives so miserable and so unsustainable, a fundamental struggle for simply daily survival, that it's become very hard, I think, for a lot of Palestinians to have that, even the mental space, let alone a political space, to begin to think about the future. They only have the Israelis on top of them. They have the PA on top of them, a collaborationist leadership that doesn't represent them and that is actually an oppressive force. So it's not easy. The One Democratic State campaign that I'm a part of with Munir, I have to emphasize, is a Palestinian-led movement. In other words, there are Israeli Jews involved, of course, but it's a Palestinian-led movement, and therefore the first steps of this movement, of this campaign, to echo Lamis, is to bring Palestinians on board, and Palestinians from the entire Palestinian community, from all the different factions and communities and so on. That's not something I can be involved with. I mean, I have to defer, obviously, to the Palestinians, and this is their job. I can help in terms of, because I know the Israeli Jewish Society, I can help in terms of formulating a program that's inclusive. I can help in terms of international advocacy, speaking as an Israeli Jew. I can help in terms of organization, but the whole issue of Palestinians dealing with other Palestinians and integrating different approaches and different ideologies and different programs, that's a Palestinian prerogative and responsibility. And so I'm really not privy to that process, and I don't intrude on that process at all. But I think what I want to say, and maybe to respond to Lamis, is two things. One is that we're in a settler colonial situation, and settler colonialism has to be ended. It has to be decolonized. That's the only way to end it. But decolonization takes different forms. Sometimes settler colonialism wins. In the US and Canada and Australia, it won. I mean, the indigenous populations are trying to carve out some kind of a space, a cultural space, maybe some resources, but basically they've accepted the existence of the settler colonial country. But I think we're very close, and we often compare ourselves to South Africa with fundamental differences, but there's some very important, I think, parallels. South Africa was a situation in which apartheid was decolonized, maybe not economically completely, but certainly in a political sense, was decolonized. But I think the ANC understood that in their decolonization of South Africa, the white population is going to remain. It's too embedded in order, to dislodge it. And therefore, their message from the Freedom Charter until the new constitution that they formulated, the ANC, was that whatever decolonization, whatever the new state is, it has to be inclusive. And I think, it's not an easy thing, and I can understand the Palestinians, absolutely, to begin to think about, well, how are we going to live in the future with Israelis? And what's the role of Israelis? And I can understand that. If I was a Palestinian, I wouldn't want to deal with that either, but we have to deal with that. Decolonization is going to involve a strong, economically and culturally and institutionally strong Israeli Jewish population that hopefully will be transcended into a new political community, as I mentioned, but that population is going to remain. It's going to be strong in many ways, and we have to find ways of decolonizing and addressing the Palestinian needs and grievances and so on. Nevertheless, from the idea of an inclusive, multi-political, pluralistic state that has to emerge, so that. I think the Al-Auda, I've read it before, but I reread it when Lamis, as Lamis was speaking and other people were speaking, when she put it up. It's a very important declaration from a Palestinian point of view. In my view, it falls short of a political program. I think what we're endeavoring to do, and I think we should get it much more into discussion with Al-Auda that I don't think has happened very much, is that in order to bring people on board, Palestinians in particular have to see what does this mean for us? What are the details? I think we have to be as concrete and with a program so they can see what rights do we have? How does the government work? As Lamis says, how does the economy work? What about land redistribution? What about our place in the wider Middle East? What about the wider Palestinian national body? What about not only the return of the refugees, what about their reintegration into society? In other words, there are a lot of, is this going to be a secular state? Is it going to be a non-sectarian state? Is it going to be a religious? There's a lot of questions we still have to, and by we, I mean the people involved in the anti-colonial struggle that are more than just Palestinians. It includes anti-colonial Israelis as well. We have to begin to flesh that out and address those sorts of things so that people have, not only people here have a concrete political plan that they can move forward, but that we can go to the international community as political actors. We have not been political actors all these years. We're great at analyzing, we're great at declaring, we're great at resisting, we're great at protesting, but we are not political actors because we don't have a political program. And that, I think, is something that we should all work on together. And I would hope that Al-Auda would be a partner with us, and we're in touch with other groups. Again, a lot of this is an intra-Palestinian sort of a thing that I'm not going to be involved with, but at some point I will be, and we will be. And I think that's the way this has to be structured.
Jeff, if I may interrupt, Jeff, for a second.
No, I'll end on that.
I'm fascinated. That Miko has to leave, and I'd like to give him a chance to, either challenge or build on or expand on this point, and then we'll go back and continue the discussion because, we're all very interested in this. So, Miko, please go ahead. And I hope that as a result of this, maybe you guys will start, talking more to one another. So, Miko, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. No, it's really hard. I don't know what there is to add to any of this. I have a lot of Palestinian activist friends in Palestine, and it's true that everything is quite local and regional. So there's some great Palestinian activists in the Naqab, and they do incredible work in Beersheba and Lakia and Rahat and other places. Great Palestinian activist in Jerusalem, in Yafa, Ramle, and I was in Lid when I spoke to Fidash Hadeh, who was, became the voice of Lid during the uprising in May. And so on and so forth. Of course, in every part of the West Bank, in El Khalil, there are great activists in Nablus and the villages and so on. So locally, there's a lot of good stuff happening, and there are a lot of excellent people who all, by the way, agree with everything that we've been saying today. And I think generally there's a consensus here. I mean, maybe some details here and there, but generally there's a consensus here. And there seems, and from what I know, from what I see, and for a very long time, the Palestinians on the ground, activists on the ground, agree with everything that's been said. And again, the difference is the problems are logistics, the problems are travel, the problems are that an activist from Hebron and an activist from Lakia and the Naqab and an activist from Jerusalem can't get together legally. And if they plan to get together, 5 minutes later, either the Palestinian secret police or the Israeli secret police will arrest them. So these are very, very serious issues that stand in the way of creating, of formulating a real strategy and a real kind of political program on the ground among these people. So maybe that's where, those of us who live on the outside can step in. I would add one thing, I think I believe Al-Awda is, I'm surprised that Al-Awda is not a bigger and more dominant movement, generally in the world, because it is the issue and it is really the movement that we should all be a part of, because it is such, Lamis laid out really the most comprehensive program on this issue, but it's really the issue that really would drive, I believe, would drive the justice back into Palestine, if you will. I think though that if I was to imagine, and I get asked this a lot, how is this going to work? What I envision, and I'd love to hear, what Lamis thought on this. When we talk about the fall of apartheid, when we talk about the fall of the Zionist state, the dismantling of the Zionist state and so on, but practically, I'm envisioning a process where, very similar to what happened in South Africa, as a result of massive sanctions and massive boycotts, and as a result of the fact that there was really nowhere to go, a white, racist president, South African president, de Klerk, stood up and said, we are freeing all the prisoners without condition, we are unbanning all the political parties without condition, and we're calling for a one-person, one-vote election, which of course I see as just the first step. So creating a one-person, one-vote democracy in Palestine is the one step that creates a level playing field for Palestinians. Now there has to be a constitution. Now there has to be a creation of how does the return happen? How do the reparations take place? I don't know. As long as the state of Israel exists, none of this is going to happen. As long as the state of Israel exists, the destruction, the killing, the genocide will never stop. The thing that could stop it is the creation of a legislature that represents the people, an executive that represents the people, and a state structure that now works in order to allow these things to take place. I don't know how that happens before that, how anything can happen before that. So I usually tell people the single democracy is not, in other words, changing Palestine into a democracy. I mean, it's a single state. Palestine has been in one state for a very long time. Transforming it into a real democracy is the first step, and then we can start talking about enabling all these other, solving all these other issues. I don't know how that happens. Anything happens before that happens, but I'd be interested to hear what Lamis has to say about that. But that's really, that's really all I have to say. This has been fascinating, and thank you all, and thanks for letting me be a part of this.
Thank you, Miko, so much for for joining us, and this just fascinating for me to hear you all. Let me propose the following. We'll have Lamis address the point, elaborate, challenge. However, Lamis, you wanted to do maybe a couple of minutes or so, and then I have several questions. I'm totally fine. I can stay through my part of the world, 45 more minutes or even longer, if anybody wants to stick around. But let's just extend it at least 15 minutes, actually 17 minutes to the half hour past our official promise, so that we, whoever can stay, we have time to elaborate on this very pressing, fascinating issues. And we certainly in the West have no credit and no legitimacy to talk about what a real democracy might look like. Anyway, that aside, please, Lamis, go ahead.
Sure. The first thing I want to address, first of all, Jeff and Miko and everybody, thank you very much. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation. I do think it is taken for granted what we do produce as political programs. I'm not just talking about Al-Auda, but I'm talking about Palestinians in general. Miko raised a very important question, Miko, and I think you know part of the answer to this. One of the reasons that Al-Auda is not bigger and more of the attacks from people who are now kind of the faces of the Palestinian solidarity movement, who started out as conflictual allies, people who are now in very multi-million-dollar mainstream organizations who dedicated entire websites to demonizing and criminalizing us, myself included, and Al-Auda for many years, and now are making a living and a career off of the same points that we were saying 21 years ago, which eventually led to the infiltration of NYPD and FBI and CIA and Israeli government operatives into our organization, and devastated and froze us and left us dealing with the new COINTELPRO demographics unit. I'm happy to share on that. So that's part of the problem, which is kind of being constantly, which I said, let's not fall into this redundant cycle of where Palestinians push a political program and are at the vanguards of their movement for liberation and then constantly challenged, but let's kind of listen and really listen to what Palestinians are saying. So Jeff, first of all, I think the world of you I have for 22 years, known about you and your work since I was a kid in this movement. So any disagreements that we have or I have are all in good faith and with a tremendous amount of love and gratitude. That said, you keep referring to Al-Auda's points of unity. It's not a political program. I've been sending in the chat, and I think you might have missed it, which was, really formed by Al-Auda. I'm the primary drafter of these documents, is the Palestinian Assembly for Liberation Founding Principles, which is a very detailed political program that addresses even how do we reunite and on what basis do we reunite? What does reintegration look like? What does sovereignty look like? What does food sovereignty look like? What does moving away from NGOs look like? I've sent that in the chat a couple of times. It's palassembly.org, palassembly.org. So that's the extension of what we started in Al-Auda. We talk about everything from the role of NGOs to the PA to reversing Oslo to how do we do that and all of this. Okay, so we go on to what both you and Miko have raised, which is the model of South Africa, and the ANC and members of the ANC have repeatedly admitted to the numerous mistakes that the ANC made by way of concessions to the white institutional powerful members of society. And those mistakes, we are watching them every day, from the murder of Black workers to what we're seeing on the streets today. So respectfully, what the ANC did and their concessions are a mistake from which I take lessons. What they did is they said 80 years back, we reached for reparations, but we pay for them. Big mistake. The white majority continued to own the land. So what I like to do, and I like to study, are both Algeria and Guatemala, along with South Africa, to understand what worked and what didn't work. Jeff, I totally hear what you're saying about, yes, Israelis are not going anywhere. Meet ahla wa sahla. Everybody stay where you are. Let's talk about what justice looks like. Let's talk about what return looks like. all of you here, the panelists, are well familiar with Salman Abu Sitta, who maps out the physical logistics of return. We have countless, from Bosnia to Guatemala to Algeria, to all countries all over the world that decolonize, examples of what does decolonization look like when you have a primary, the original indigenous inhabitants, and then the secondary, the colonizers. The formulas are quite simple. This applies to less than 10% of the Israeli population. They would be given, let's say, for example, like the Algerian model, you have 6 months, you accept equality, you accept to move to a house a few doors down, or you pay a bunch of money and you let the Palestinians return as equals. Why is this not a viable, acceptable model? It is for Palestinians. It has happened for other colonizers previously. And what did most colonizers do? They left because the idea of losing this privilege and that supremacy was not bearable to them. And look, maybe they won't, and I think many won't, right? And those many who won't will be integrated into Palestinian society, multicultural society, indigenous society that prioritizes health and social welfare and all of these things and justice, and learns from the lessons of Zionist and British and even Ottoman colonization and does better and develops a better society. That is realistic. So it is not realistic to keep saying we can only operate within the paradigm and the framework of the ardent Zionist who sees no future but holding on to everything. That's not how the world has worked for the past, 1,000 years, right? That's not how it's working as you and I are sitting here and speaking. So there are other models that I think are acceptable to the majority of people. Halla, what are the steps of how do we get there and how do we secure consent? Power only concedes to power, right? Let's talk about the power of Palestinians. I think at its highest point, the Palestinian GDP reached about 8 trillion, I believe. Munir, you're brilliant, you can correct me later. But let's say, for example, right? In that same year, the Israeli military budget was 13.5 trillion, aside from another 3.5 trillion from US aid, right? And in that same year, fact, colonial expansion as a result of a few homemade rockets, right, coming out of Gaza. The Palestinian people are not a weak people. Add to the fact that the Palestinian people are not all based in Palestine, right? The majority of us are outside. We are not going to lose if for that reason alone. And it is for that reason that the Israeli government coordinates with the US government and various European governments the minutia of our lives. They know the minutia of my life, and I have a working class income. I have no access to real power, to real finance. They understand that so long as the majority of Palestinians remain outside of Palestine, Israel has not won. Despite all its money and all its power, Israel is still clamoring for political and diplomatic legitimacy, and it is struggling every day to affect this. To ask of us Palestinians to say, well, give me the exact program of how you're going to win this. It's all of these things together. When we talk about sanctions, we begin with the people's sanctions. We begin with the block the boat actions. We begin with creating new legal cultures in the US and globally that know that the real criminalization has to be of Israel and Israelis and settlers and the paramilitary and all of these things. This delegitimization has a direct connection to the direct power, material power, even the military power that Israel has over Palestinian lives. And that is the heart. Add to this, when we are creating these new paradigms and normalizing the right of Palestinians to resist with arms and helping to facilitate and bringing Palestinians into Congress and having congressional hearings about the right to return, which we are working towards, by the way. We just don't publish all our work. Or the anti-IRA, anti-Semitism definition work. We're bringing this, we're going to government. We don't publish our work, right? All of this builds Palestinian power and weakens Israeli legitimacy, which therefore weakens Israel. Nobody went to South Africa and said, hey, give me right away, right now, exactly how you're going to go from being under full subjugation to liberation. Nobody said that to the Algerians, right? And speaking of the Algerians, one critical part to that was reinstituting the National Liberation Project, meaning removing what were called Beni Oui, right? Eulad and Na'am, right? The collaborators, the colonial informants, right? Removing these people. The Palestinian Assembly for Liberation is specifically dedicated for this, to reprioritize the original Palestinian principles for liberation of 1968, right? And to make sure that we are included in all political processes that speak of our rights and our lands and all of these injustices, right? The PA's security forces came and physically threatened it because the PA was specifically built to divert and liquidate this voice, these rights, and this majority Palestinian presence in service of the US imperialist project that is called Israel and its colonial project. I think that, does that address everything? So please, Jeff, go to palassembly.org. We are mobilizing this reunification project in very detailed material ways, political, ideological, physical. Ubay Aboudi is well aware of this. We're well aware of you. We love you very much, but please think outside of the paradigm of what do the Zionists want. And I think that's what I tried to begin with in this, is I'm not so much concerned about Zionist consent as it exists now, but Zionist consent and perspective when we reach that phase, and it's coming a lot quicker than all of us think, folks. I assure you, it's coming a lot quicker than all of us think. So let's get in the right headspace. Let's really appreciate the power and vision of Palestinians on the ground like Munir, and also Palestinians out in the diaspora. One thing I do want to say, because Palestinians on the ground, like you said, Jeff, are under so much pressure, they're not able to constantly develop and plan and strategize and think about what the global struggle looks like. That's why we formed PAL, because we understand that as Palestinians who are living outside, not under duress, right, are privileged, and we have the intellectual capacity and the material and physical and intellectual resources to sit and map this out in support of our people who are giving their lives, like Munir, their comfort to ensure that our psychological history, our family's history, our own history, and our futures are not erased. And that's what PAL Assembly, which is an extension of Al-Auda, is doing. I hope that addresses it.
Lamis, thank you so much. I think you've addressed it and also opened up a lot of further venues for discussion, debate, exchange, and collaboration. I see some comments asking for, we'll try to organize this, maybe a write-up, a page or two of the speakers so that we can then post it, and then we can also get a clear sense what all of us who are not direct participants or at least protagonists can do to support the struggle. So we have several hands up, and I will start with Kyle, who's been very patient, raised your hand a long time ago, Kyle. So if you could go ahead, if I may ask.
Yep. Oh, sorry, I'm on the phone.
I'm very sorry, but I'll ask you to be like kind of be a brief, very specific questions that then we can pass on to the speakers, and then I will have Radhika and Suzanne. So if there's any coherence among the questions, we'll address them all. Thank you.
All right, so Jeff, I can't tell you how many times I've tried to bring up global football and just been totally ignored. And I'm sorry Miko had to leave, because I want to talk about Qatar. And Qatar's role in the region is getting pretty influential these days, especially with their negotiations with the Taliban. But they have flights to Israel recently, and they also have the World Cup. So I want to know what you guys think about the role of Qatar in the region, because as we've said, having flights to Israel is kind of not good for the whole one-state solution that we're trying to envision in boycotting Israel the best we can. So yeah, the role of Qatar, that's what I'm interested in hearing y'all talk about.
Wonderful, thank you, Kyle. So let's move to Radhika. I have you next on the screen as raising your hand. If you can maybe add to that, so then we'll open up the floor to the speakers.
Yeah, so thanks, Claudia, and thanks to Suzanne Weiss and Claudia Chauffin for organizing this fantastic panel, and thanks to the speakers. Like I've said, it's powerful, and I want to also say that if Lamis is the voice of young Palestine, watch out settler colonialism, watch out Zionism. I think this has been fantastic. I feel so energized and deeply moved. I have a couple of questions, but I also wanted to say one other thing. I completely agree, Lamis, with your criticism of what exactly happened in South Africa. I think this is something you have to bear in mind. I've been listening to everything you've had to say about your Palestinian Assembly plan for liberation. I think you're absolutely on. And if I may suggest, What you are saying actually amounts to saying that you cannot have Palestinian liberation without socialism of some type, because you're talking about the ownership of land, you're talking about the ownership of the enterprises, you're talking about how to integrate people fully into the economy. You cannot do that with the kind of high unemployment economy, which is all capitalism has to offer to countries like Palestine. So I think that this is something you have to take on board. I don't care if you don't call it socialism, but I think that is kind of what used to be called socialism. So I just wanted to say that. And so my question is this. I had this sense from a number of you, Lamis was just the last one, but a couple of other speakers, I think Munir perhaps, and also certainly Jonathan and others, everybody has said something that hints to the fact that we are reaching some kind of climax. We are reaching some kind of crescendo, both in terms of the repression being unleashed by Israel and in terms of the unity and the resistance of Palestinians. You know, we were told back in May and June, Palestinians achieved a level of unity that has been unprecedented. And I think that is so hopeful. And Jeff, I want to say, I agree kind of with what you say about hope, but you can also see it as a sharpening of the contradictions. The contradictions are sharpening and there will be openings. And I would like everyone to comment on how they see this crescendo. What is changing in Israel, among Palestinians, in the region, vis-a-vis the United States and vis-a-vis those who have, despite many disappointers like India. I feel ashamed that I'm originally from India, because India has gone from supporting Palestine unconditionally to this current closeness to Israel, which is absolutely shameful. But also in terms of international alliances, what do you see are the main changes? What are the main sources of the sharpening of contradictions and hope, and what may perhaps be holding things back? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Radhika. Suzanne, you have a question. You've also raised your hand. Please go ahead. You're muted, Suzanne.
Unmute me.
Yeah, that's it. You're better now, Suzanne.
You unmute me. Okay.
You are unmuted now. Go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you very much. There are many, many wonderful questions that I have, but as a person who is acting as a activist in the Canadian struggle for assisting the Palestinians to freedom, I would like to say, well, Miko Peled said, you know, speaking of a one-state solution, it will happen only if we act. And we're talking a lot about the one-state solution, which, by the way, I feel it's the Palestinians who will ultimately decide how the Palestinian state will be formed and what its what it will be demanding. But what I'm saying right now is we have an urgent issue. How do we get there? And we have a problem, and that is we have to address our own governments. For instance, in Canada, our own governments who support the Israeli state of apartheid. And there is a program, and that is that, and not for the Palestinian state, but that we as people who want to assist the Palestinians, we are asked to accept. It's from the Palestinians themselves. It's from the BDS movement, and they have a program. And the point is to follow that program. I'm asking the speakers where they stand on how we can promote and strengthen that road forward? Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Let me throw in a third. I'm going to take advantage of, of my role. But let me just throw a third one that I hope you can sort of blend in together. So what, in your view, is the role in this sort of resistance movement and in the structure of Israeli society of Arab Jews? And I'm asking this from a sort of a selfish point of view, because my paternal grandfather was born in Syria. He was Jewish. And the time I've spent there seemed to be like a no place to categorize people of his, of his ancestry, whom I have to say they're, pretty much Europeanized by now. So they think like Europeans, even if they are not. And the other one is a fellow that I met in the summer of 2018, who was a Palestinian, but the son of a Jewish mother. So it was extraordinary that he had to sort of bend over backwards and give up on Judaism, which he didn't have a problem with, and embrace Islam, the religion of his wife. So in other words, there seemed to be, tensions in there within the very hierarchical structure that you pointed to, Lamis, in Palestinian society, ethnic, class, and so on. How do you deal with that? Anyway, that's my addition to the Qatar and sports and movement, and Suzanne, how to join the struggle from outside, and Radhika, I can't reproduce it, but I hope you remember the question and throw it all together. So who would like to, maybe Jeff would like to address this, and then we move to Lamis. And then, is Munir around still? I think he had to leave. Oh no, I'm sorry, Munir is still here. So Munir, you had another commitment.
I'm here for until 7.
Yeah, just go ahead first with however much or little you want to address of these points, and then we'll move to Jeff and then Lamis.
Okay. Regarding the change of policy in the world towards Palestine, yes, Radhika's question. Yes, unfortunately, we are witnessing a change in terms of solidarity with Palestine. And I think that from the official state positions point of view, this change is negative. You gave the example of India, and this is a very strong and important example, because India, as a state in the non-allied world, had a clear position, and also as a post-colonial country that also could appreciate the Palestinian struggle, even during the British Mandate and after the British Mandate, and even opposed the partition of Palestine because of its opposition to the partition of India. There were, it could affiliate with Palestine. But similarly, you could also mention the Arab world, the Arab countries. Now, we're not only seeing peace agreements, maybe like the one that happened between Egypt and Israel, which was, in my opinion, a shameful example of peace agreements, but we're also seeing peace agreements that are breaching consensus among the Arab countries, but also that are promoting normalization in a very rude way, disregarding the injustices that have been ongoing in Palestine since the Nakba until today, disregarding the future of this part of the world, and only focusing on, on slogans and on economic, to be honest, cooperation, mainly, and not for a real interest, in my opinion, to these countries like the Emirates or like Bahrain. I don't think they really have a genuine interest in that normalization with Israel, with the exception of abiding by what Donald Trump basically told them to do. And I can see that also within states. I do advocacy quite frequently with diplomats in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, in the UN Human Rights Council. And in many cases, I find that I am talking to very sympathetic diplomats who are very much convinced of the justice that we are talking about, but at the same time are unable to vote in the right direction, only because of this imbalance of power, not only the physical power that we are living under here in Palestine, but also the fear of what a vote might result in the world. We are also observing how funding for civil society here has become more and more conditional and more restrictive. And we can see how this responds to the Israeli attempt to engineer Palestinian civil society through criminalizing and outlawing some of our active organizations in order to engineer some more benign organizations that might work according to their interest. This is all the scene which makes me sometimes led to feel pessimistic. Despite that, I am not pessimistic. I still feel that among the peoples and the nations in the world, there is a growing understanding to the reality that we are living under here. I know, for example, now that the understanding and the normalization of the term apartheid, which people did not dare to use not a decade ago, I'm not talking about 10 years ago, just a couple of years ago. Now it's becoming more and more normalized through mainstream international as well as local human rights organizations using this term, giving the analysis. I've understood that many diplomats around the world, even in capitals, have expressed that they agree with the analysis, for example, of the Human Rights Watch report, but they think that the use of the term apartheid is not useful. So it's still their political understanding of how things should be led and dealt with. However, I do truly believe that through consistent explanation, documentation, as well as dissemination of truth and information, this understanding will become eventually more accepted and more normalized, and it will be our platform in that space, in that moment, to continue struggling for liberation, for real liberation, and not only for this management of conflict that we have been dealing with in the past couple of decades, that has been only bringing about more persecution, stronger apartheid, stronger oppression of the Palestinian people. Since this must be the last time that I talk in this webinar, I must say that I'm also very impressed, Lamis, with your power and with your intellect and charisma. Thank you for your presentation, and also to say that I do agree with your thesis. I do agree that we have to struggle, that we have to and that we should claim our cause well and be able to represent it. I do also agree that we have to work hard on not only one person, one vote. One person, one vote is only one of what we need, one of the elements of what we need. But the full transitional justice, which is actually what it's the thesis that I wrote for my PhD, actually, is what we need to seek. Full and by the way, return as part of reparations, but we have to make sure that we constitute guarantees of non-repetition. For example, introducing a new principle in this part of the world called equality, which Israel until now rejects to recognize that it must exist as a constitutional value. Make sure that we cancel all the laws that have been established since 1948 that have displaced, dispossessed, persecuted all these people, to make sure that there is some, that the reparation also have the satisfaction, to create memorials and establish memorials for the victims, to remember the victims, to think about them, to talk about them, etc. But the new state that we are talking about must certainly take into consideration all of the population of that exists today in Palestine, makes sure to establish justice for everyone, and this has to be carefully engineered. It's very important. I'm sure, I know you agree with me. We have to make sure that this transformation that we are seeking is certainly careful, not only for the Palestinian population, but also for the Jewish population that exists here. This is something I am sure we all agree on. And therefore, I believe that this is something that we need to continue thinking about. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Munir. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Jeff is still around, so we have the three of you. Jeff, how can you challenge, build on, expand, addressing, I think that the first question was directed to you, the Qatar and soccer, was that, if I remember correctly, Kyle? Anyway, and then we have the, the other questions. I'm particularly interested, I'm going to put a pitch there in the issue of the social, political, and cultural identity of Arab Jews. And so please go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, well, this has really been a great discussion, and it's just kind of, it should be just whetting our appetites, because there are so many issues, that we should be getting into. I guess, first, before I get into the particular questions, I want to emphasize the fact that that we're talking about decolonization. I mean, that means the end of Israel. Let's be clear. There is no more Israel. And the Israelis certainly have some say, and they have to have some say, as Munir says, in what the new society is. But we're talking about a fundamental transformation, which is the word Munir just used, into a new polity, a new civil society, a new political community. And that political community does not have to include only the people living in the country. It can deal with, it can relate to the wider Palestinian national body that Lamis talks about as well. But the point of decolonization is decolonization, that we're kind of, I mean, and we have to have a strategy. What is effective decolonization? Because I agree, certainly in South Africa, that thorough decolonization did not happen. Certainly economically. So we have to really think it through. But the point is, this is a Palestinian-led, at least our part of it, the One Democratic State campaign is Palestinian-led, and therefore no new state or new entity can emerge that doesn't fundamentally address the Palestinian needs, the Palestinian grievances, the Palestinian visions of what the new society should be. And it could very well be that, like in South Africa, that most Israeli Jews are simply not a part of this process. I'm not trying to present a situation in which, Israeli Jews are going to embrace this in any way. Israeli Jews, like the whites in South Africa, overwhelmingly are going to reject any of this process. So I'm talking about especially strategically in terms of mobilizing the support we need to move forward politically, a kind of a tripartite alliance. And that is a Palestinian-led political movement, again, with a program, with a vision, and so on, that then uses anti-colonial Israeli Jews like me and Ilan Pape and others that are involved in the One Democratic State campaign and in this anti-colonial struggle. But then together as stakeholders, we're kind of the ones, but again, we're partners, but the Israeli Jews are the junior partners to the Palestinians that are leading this struggle. Then we have to take this program and the organization and so on, and the strategy, and then mobilize the international civil society. And that leads me into BDS, because we've always supported BDS. My organization, ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, supported BDS before it was called BDS. The problem with the BDS movement is it's not connected to a political end game. And again, you can't be in a political struggle. I really believe this. And maybe someone will disabuse me of this illusion. I don't believe you can be in a political struggle and be a political actor without having a political program. And the three elements of BDS are not a political program. They're kind of slogans, or they're nice, end the occupation. And another problem with them, by the way, is that they reflect a two-state approach. Because don't forget, 2 out of the 3 elements, one is end the occupation. So again, we're focusing on 22% of the country. And another essential point is equal rights for Palestinians in Israel. So right here we have that dichotomy. We've got Israel here, we've got an occupation there, and that is not the basis of the political vision that I don't think any of us have really. And these 3 points were formulated in 2005 when the BDS movement began, but even before that, in 2000, when there was a Palestinian call that had to do with normalization. That's when these 3 elements were developed. I think 21 years later, it's time to go back to those elements and to rethink them, those 3 elements. And at the same time, I think the BDS movement has to become a tool of a political movement. It can't be a standalone sort of a thing, because then we're, again, the question is, what are we BDSing for? Even if we have great successes like Ben and Jerry's, how in the hell does that liberate Palestine? I think there's some real issues in BDS that we have to talk about. And I think that, the BDS movement should join, again, the other Palestinian-led movements that are beginning to formulate a political program. Just real quick, in terms of Qatar, it's true that, they're part of this whole normalization process that's going on, the Abraham Accords and what happened with Jordan and Egypt and so on, and Saudi Arabia. That's happening. And I think what that means for us practically is that Israel is trying and succeeding to marginalize the Palestinian issue. In other words, it's trying to, when Bennett went to meet Biden a couple months ago, Palestine wasn't even on the agenda. Biden brought it up, for 30 seconds. It wasn't even, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about all these other sorts of things, military wares. So that I think one of the great dangers, if we, and especially the Palestinians, don't become political actors assertively in the political process, is that, we're going to have trouble. It's going to be a double struggle, not only the struggle for Palestinian liberation, but the struggle to even be in the room, even we have to fight the market. We'll have to bring the Palestinian issue back onto the agenda before we can deal with it. So we have to really oppose at this point, this attempt to marginalize and disappear the Palestinians completely, which is a continuation of the last century and more. and it's a real process. And I think it's really a danger. And we have to be just not more assertive. We have to come in. It's a mantra with me, a political program, but we can talk about that later. And finally, in terms of the Arab Jews, you know, the hope always was, of course, that the Arab Jews, the Mizrahim, would be a bridge between the Zionists and the Palestinians and play a role in peace. But, you know, there's another story here that we can't get into now, and that is the Arab Jews were not only co-opted, but they were deculturalized by the, by the Zionists, by the European Zionists. You had a little bit of a breakout of that in the 70s with the Black Panthers. And it's interesting, the Black Panthers did talk about Palestinians and did begin to go back to the political implications of where they came from, but that was quickly shut down, and the Black Panthers were replaced by Shas, which is an Ashkenazi copying ultra-Orthodox political and corrupt political party. So I think the Arab Jews will come in. Let me just say this, that for the Israeli Jews, as I mentioned, they're not going to be part of this process, but I think they'll become a part of it. And that's why the inclusiveness that I mentioned with the ANC is important when we get to the stage of transition. What happened in South Africa was that they opposed it, but the ANC strategy was to bypass the whites in South Africa and to go directly to the international civil society, not governments, to civil society with a political program, which was always one person, one vote. And they stayed with that to the very end. And then the whites, when apartheid finally collapsed, the whites had no choice, but they went through the transition. In other words, you could make an argument that South Africa is functioning in a way they didn't expect before. I think that could happen with Israeli Jews as well. They're not going to be active participants, but when we get to the stage of transition, which is going to be through this tripartite alliance, then I think that without any choice, they'll come in, and hopefully that will be. But because a lot of people say to me, well, how could this possibly happen to one state? The Israelis will never agree. Well, I don't see that as an obstacle. I think it's true they'll never agree, but we have to bypass them. We have to build a movement that isn't dependent on them. And in the end, they'll come into a transition into the political polity that we decide on. And in that, then during the transition, then there's an opening for Arab Jews to come back, and then they could really play a role in terms of bridging the Palestinian and wider Arab societies and so on with the Israeli Jewish society that is going to be a part of this whole end game.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and that gives us something very specific to fight for internationally as well, which is the whole point of how do we support the democratization and decolonization of Palestine. So following your lead that it is a Palestinian-led movement, let me invite our Palestinian guests and friends to close the panel today. And thank you everyone for your patience in staying, so many of you, an hour beyond what we had announced. So let's go the old way, ladies first, and then, I'm sorry, no. Let's say Munir.
No, that's okay. That's perfect, because I just want to address a few, and then I'd love to hear Munir.
So we'll give the closing words to the Palestinian, to our Palestinian friends and guests. Munir, go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, I have to be in a meeting in 2 minutes, so that's I appreciate that.
That's perfect.
So Lamis, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to talk together, to meet and to discuss this very important issue. I think today's webinar has really enriched me myself. I feel that I've learned a lot today, and I've met, well, I've known everybody from the speakers. I haven't known Lamis before, and I'm really happy to have met her, and I would like to extend more conversations with her in the future. But I'm also happy to have heard and learned from the experiences of others. I've been learning from Jeff's wisdom for a while, and always happy to be his partner in working towards justice here in Palestine. Thank you very much, Claudia, for this great organization. Thank you to all the persons who have taken 3 hours of their time to listen to us and to communicate with us and to engage with us. We really appreciate this. We hope that together we can hopefully build a stronger movement towards justice, and I'm confident that this is coming. Every pessimistic thing any of us have said should not give us the feeling that we're not getting there. We are sure we're getting there. I think this is only natural that justice will prevail. Thank you very much.
Munir, I want to catch you before you go and say 2 things. Number one, I think that you epitomize, please forgive, all of you forgive me for any apparent romanticization of Palestinians inside Palestine, but you really epitomize the beauty and the richness and the strength of Palestinians, even in your extension of kindness under the worst situations, and your production of intellectual labor and programs and otherwise. And I just kind of want to stress that how the world really takes that for granted, but your people outside don't. And we miss you all very, very, very much. And we're so grateful. And it's our hope only that we could be a service or return a fraction of what you do for us. So Allah yirda alayk wa ya'tik alf afiyah. So thank you so much for everything, Munir. I just wanted to kind of say, to the questions very briefly, Claudia and everybody, truly thank you so much, and Jeff for engaging. Jeff, read our political program between the lines. A political program also requires other things aside from a political program. We don't always expressly articulate things, which brings me to your question, Claudia, which was a lot of what we said in that document is really just the reversal of systems of oppression, which ultimately leads you to an indigenous framed and developed version of what the West calls socialism, but we have as communalism, organic part of Palestinian society that comes in different manifestations. And that was what we tried to articulate, along with, again, read between the lines, Jeff, and we could talk more directly about what our political program looks like. The question of why are we in a crescendo? The power of the US globally is waning. The forces of resistance against US hegemony in the region are clearly growing quicker and faster than any of us have ever expected. I'm not at all disheartened by the removal of the onion skin of the collaboration between Arab regimes and Israel and the US. I'm actually quite grateful for it. Munir unfortunately pays the price because he, like other Palestinians, are on the ground. I see it in terms of this is a hastening of the polarization and the exposure of where all of the sides are, who is with fascism and death and who is with liberation and human progress. That's really what we're seeing. But what we're also seeing is that this is causing a polarization on the ground within the Arab states themselves. So I'm not remotely upset about this. It's difficult for now. BDS is certainly the least we could do, but BDS has been problematic. We saw BDS issue a statement against the work of Pal Action recently. So we really need to think bigger and better, which is what does a people's sanctions look like? Delegitimizing Israel and really focusing on what's happening. And there's a lot that I could say. We don't have enough time. But I think one tactic, one important tool we need people to do more that is very underestimated, and I urge people to really give this thought, is that the exposure, the naming and the shaming of Israeli violence, of the violence of Zionism, ideologically, morally, and physically, naming and shaming the institutions, the individual actors, the neighbors, all of them. I can't overstate how critical this is to directly disincentivizing settlements, to exposing them, to weakening them in a very material sense. This is why, another reason why we're seeing this crescendo, the entrance of Palestine and the reality of Palestinian life on social media. It took away the power of state media and state propaganda. The exposure of the nature of Israel and Zionism and Israelis and Zionists is very important, not to be underestimated. I hope more would give more time, and I'm happy to share resources to do that. Again, I thank you all very much, and thanks for letting me go over time and for everybody's kindness. And Jeff, I hope I finally get to meet you one day. Radhika and Claudia, thanks a ton. And you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Lamis, so much. And thank you, everyone, again. And let that be the closing words. And we hope you all join us in a future event. Thank you so much.